The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Marcus Hayes pushed the industrial mop across the marble floor of Sterling Automotive headquarters, watching the water spread in wide arcs that caught the reflection of the glass elevator shafts rising 40 stories above him. He had learned to find a rhythm in this work, a meditative quality in the repetition that kept his mind from wandering too far into the past or future, keeping him anchored in the simple present of soap and water and tile. The overnight shift suited him, allowed him to work in relative solitude while the executives slept in their expensive beds and his daughter slept in their small apartment across the city, dreaming of engines and velocity and the physics of motion that consumed her waking hours. The doors burst open at 3 a.m, shattering the quiet with the sharp percussion of expensive heels and urgent voices. Victoria Sterling swept through the entrance flanked by 6 people in suits, their faces tight with the particular strain that came from problems with no easy solutions, and Marcus recognized the body language of crisis before anyone spoke a word. He had seen it countless times before, in command centers and on flight decks, that electricity in the air when something critical hung in the balance and time was running out. The prototype is locked in the testing bay, a balding engineer was saying, his voice pitched high with stress. The pneumatic system seized during the final calibration run. We've got the automotive press arriving in 6 hours for the demonstration, and if we can't show them a functioning vehicle, Sterling loses the military contract worth $200 million. Victoria stopped in the center of the lobby, her presence commanding attention even at this ungodly hour, and Marcus found himself pausing mid-stroke to watch the way she processed information, the calculation visible in her dark eyes as she assessed and prioritized and began issuing orders. She was younger than he had expected for someone running a company of this magnitude, perhaps 32 or 33, with the kind of severe beauty that came from expensive maintenance and careful control, her black suit cut with precision and her dark hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her entire face into an expression of permanent alertness. "Where's the hydraulic specialist?" she demanded, and one of the suits shook his head. "Still in Germany. His flight was cancelled. We've called everyone on the emergency list, but no one can get here and diagnose the problem in time. The bay is sealed, we can't access it manually without potentially damaging the prototype further, and the override system requires a complete reset that could take 8 hours even if we knew exactly what went wrong." Marcus moved his mop bucket closer to the wall, trying to make himself invisible as he always did when the important people arrived, but his eyes tracked the conversation with the kind of attention that never fully shut off no matter how many years passed. He could see the schematic they were pulling up on a tablet, could recognize the basic structure of what they were describing even from 15 feet away, and his hands tightened on the mop handle as muscle memory threatened to surface and remind him of everything he used to know. Victoria's gaze swept the lobby and landed on him, perhaps because he was the only person not moving, not speaking, not adding to the chaos of voices competing for her attention. She studied him for a long moment, and Marcus felt the weight of that assessment, the way powerful people looked at those beneath them with a mixture of curiosity and dismissal, seeing the uniform but not the person inside it. "You," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "The janitor. What's your name?" "Marcus Hayes, The military formality slipped out before he could stop it, and he saw her eyebrow lift slightly at the automatic respect in his tone. "You've been standing there watching this whole time. I assume you heard what we're dealing with." It wasn't a question, but Marcus nodded anyway. "Tell me, Hayes, do you know anything about complex pneumatic systems? About the kind of precision engineering that goes into a $50 million prototype vehicle?" The engineers shifted uncomfortably, a few of them exchanging glances that suggested they thought this was a waste of precious time, and Marcus felt his throat tighten around all the words he couldn't say. He knew exactly how those systems worked, could probably diagnose the problem in 10 minutes and fix it in another 30, but saying so would open doors he had spent 7 years keeping firmly closed. "I've picked up some things," he said carefully, keeping his voice neutral and his eyes down in the way that people expected from someone in his position. Victoria's laugh was sharp and cold, a sound without humor. "Some things. How delightful. Tell me, Hayes, would you like to make some extra money tonight? I'll make you a bet, right here, right now, in front of all these witnesses." She gestured to the gathered executives and engineers, and Marcus felt his stomach drop as phones came out, as recording lights blinked to life, as the moment crystallized into something that would be documented and preserved. "You claim you've picked up some things about engineering. So here's the deal. You go into that testing bay, and you diagnose and repair whatever is wrong with our prototype vehicle. You have 4 hours before the press arrives. If you succeed, if you actually manage to do what an entire team of specialized engineers cannot do, I will personally double your salary for a full year." The room had gone quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy and expectant, and Marcus could feel the eyes on him, could sense the barely suppressed amusement rippling through the crowd of expensive suits. Someone laughed, a short bark of disbelief, and someone else muttered something about this being ridiculous, but Victoria held up a hand and the murmurs died away. "But if you fail," she continued, her voice dropping lower, taking on an edge that felt almost cruel, "if you waste our time with whatever half-understood mechanical knowledge you think you possess, if you touch that prototype and make things worse, you're fired. Immediately. No severance, no reference, no second chances. You walk out of here tonight with nothing." Marcus stood very still, the mop handle solid in his hands, and felt the weight of the choice pressing down on him like gravity multiplying. Every instinct he had cultivated over the past 7 years told him to decline, to step back into invisibility, to protect the careful life he had built from the ruins of everything he had lost. But then he thought of Emma, his 7-year-old daughter currently asleep in their apartment, thought of the way she had shown him her project earlier that evening with such desperate hope in her eyes. She was building a model engine for the youth engineering competition tomorrow afternoon, trying to demonstrate principles of thermodynamics and mechanical efficiency with nothing but salvaged parts and determination, working by the dim light of their kitchen lamp because the proper facilities at the community center had lost their funding 3 months ago. She needed new tools, needed access to better equipment, needed the scholarship opportunity that winning would provide, and Marcus had watched her struggle with broken calipers and insufficient lighting and felt his heart break a little more each day. "What would I need to do?" he heard himself ask, and Victoria's smile was all teeth. "Just fix my car, Hayes. The one in the testing bay. It's really not that complicated, is it? A janitor should be able to handle a simple repair job." The engineers laughed at that, and Marcus felt the humiliation of it wash over him, felt himself being reduced to a punchline in someone else's story, but he thought of Emma's face when she showed him her drawings, the way she asked him questions about engineering principles that cut straight to the heart of concepts he had once known as intimately as breathing. 4 hours, he said quietly, meeting Victoria's eyes. "And if I fix it, you double my salary for a year." "When you fail, you mean?" "But yes, those are the terms. We have it all on record." She gestured to the tablets and phones still recording, documenting every moment of what she clearly believed would be a spectacle of failure and overconfidence. "The testing bay is through those doors. The technical manuals are in the observation room if you need them, though I suspect they won't be much help. Clock starts now. 4 hours until the automotive press arrives and we need that vehicle operational." Marcus set down his mop, removed his work gloves, and walked toward the massive steel doors that led to the testing facility, feeling the weight of all those watching eyes, all that barely concealed mockery, all that assumption that he was nothing more than what his uniform suggested. He paused at the threshold and looked back at Victoria, at the way she stood with her arms crossed and her expression set in lines of cold certainty, and he felt something shift inside him, some old familiar resolve that he had thought died with Sarah all those years ago. He said, his voice carrying across the lobby with the kind of projection that came from years of making himself heard over engine noise and wind, "I'll fix your car. And then I'm going to walk out of here the same way I walked in. But my daughter's going to have what she needs tomorrow. That's all I'm asking for." The doors closed behind him with a pneumatic hiss, sealing him inside the testing bay, and Marcus stood in the darkness for a moment before the motion sensors triggered the overhead lights and illuminated the vehicle at the center of the space. It was beautiful in the way that precision engineering was always beautiful, all clean lines and purposeful design, a next-generation autonomous transport vehicle that combined electric motors with hybrid pneumatic systems for efficiency and power. He could see immediately where the problem was, could trace the logic of the failed calibration in the way certain components sat wrong, slightly out of alignment, pressure readings off by margins that would seem small but compound into catastrophic failure. He moved to his locker first, the old military footlocker that he kept in the janitor's storage room, hidden behind cleaning supplies and forgotten maintenance equipment. His hands shook slightly as he worked the combination lock, and when he lifted the lid, he found himself staring at tools he hadn't touched in 7 years, each one wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, each one maintained even though he had convinced himself he would never use them again. The precision torque wrenches, the pressure gauges calibrated to tolerances most mechanics never needed, the diagnostic equipment that spoke of training far beyond what any civilian certification required. He lifted them out reverently, feeling the weight and balance of each tool like greeting old friends, and then he turned back to the vehicle and began to work. Drop a comment below and let everyone know where you're watching this story unfold from. Are you here from New York? London? Somewhere completely unexpected? The community would love to know. Marcus Hayes had not always been the night janitor at Sterling Automotive, had not always worn the blue uniform and pushed the mop and kept his eyes down when important people passed. There had been a time, not so long ago and yet impossibly distant, when he had worn a different uniform, one that came with rank and responsibility and the weight of lives depending on his expertise. He had been Captain Marcus Hayes then, United States Air Force, a maintenance officer specializing in the kind of complex mechanical systems that kept multi-million-dollar aircraft operational in conditions that would break lesser machines and kill unprepared men. He had met Sarah during his second tour, at a charity event on base where she was volunteering with the Education Outreach Program, teaching children of military families about science and engineering through hands-on demonstrations. She had been explaining hydraulic principles to a crowd of fascinated 8-year-olds, her hands moving expressively as she described pressure and flow and the elegant logic of mechanical advantage, and Marcus had been transfixed by the way she made complex concepts accessible, the way she lit up when someone understood. They had talked for hours that night, discovering a shared passion for making things work, for understanding how systems fit together, for the particular satisfaction that came from diagnosing a problem and applying the right solution. Their relationship had unfolded with the intensity that came from military life, every moment precious because tomorrow might bring deployment or transfer or the 1,000 complications that came with serving. They married after 6 months, and Emma had been born 2 years later, arriving in the world with her mother's curiosity and her father's focus, a child who asked why before she could properly walk and who took apart toys to understand how they functioned before she had the vocabulary to describe what she was discovering. Sarah had been the one who truly nurtured that passion, who sat with Emma at the kitchen table and turned learning into play, who made physics and mathematics and engineering principles feel like magic rather than work. Marcus had been deployed when the accident happened, had been 8,000 miles away in a desert forward operating base when the phone call came through that would shatter his world into before and after. A drunk driver running a red light, Sarah's car hit broadside at an intersection 3 blocks from their home, the impact so severe that she had been declared dead at the scene. Emma had been at school, had been spared the physical danger but not the emotional devastation, and Marcus had been granted emergency leave to fly home and hold his sobbing 4-year-old daughter and try to explain why mommy was never coming back. The months after had been a blur of funeral arrangements and grief counseling and well-meaning friends who said things like time heals all wounds and she's in a better place now, phrases that meant nothing when he woke up alone and remembered that Sarah was gone and Emma was asking questions he had no answers for. He had tried to continue with the Air Force, had returned to duty after his compassionate leave expired, but he found himself unable to focus, unable to care about maintenance schedules and readiness reports when his daughter was being raised by a series of babysitters and his nights were consumed by memories of everything he had lost. The breaking point had come during a routine inspection, when Marcus had been reviewing the hydraulic systems on a cargo transport and had realized he couldn't remember the last 3 steps he had completed, couldn't account for 15 minutes of time, had simply been going through motions while his mind circled the drain of grief and absence. The realization that he might miss something critical, might sign off on a system that wasn't truly ready, might be responsible for putting lives at risk because he could no longer fully be present, had hit him like a physical blow. He had walked off the flight line that day and submitted his resignation that evening, taking an early separation that his commanding officer approved with reluctance and understanding. He had moved with Emma to the city where Sarah's parents lived, thinking that family support would help them both heal, but the relationship had been strained by grief and blame and the particular pain that came from seeing reminders of Sarah in her daughter's face every single day. Marcus had needed to work, needed income to support Emma and pay rent and keep them both fed and clothed, and he had taken the first job that offered flexibility and didn't require explanations about gaps in employment or reasons for leaving a promising military career. Sterling Automotive had been hiring night custodial staff, and the position had come with health insurance and enough pay to afford a modest apartment and put food on the table. 7 years had passed in a rhythm of nights spent cleaning and days spent with Emma, watching her grow from a grief-stricken 4-year-old into a bright, curious 7-year-old who inherited her mother's passion for understanding how things worked. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in a complex that had seen better decades, driving a car that Marcus kept running through constant maintenance and ingenuity, budgeting every dollar carefully because there was never quite enough for everything Emma needed. But they were together, and they were surviving, and Marcus had convinced himself that this was enough, that he had made his peace with being someone different from who he used to be. He had kept the tools though, had maintained them with the same care he had once applied to critical aircraft systems, cleaning and oiling them every few months even though he never used them for anything more demanding than basic home repairs. The military footlocker stayed in his work locker at Sterling Automotive, and sometimes during slow nights he would open it and look at the precision instruments inside and remember what it felt like to be someone who mattered, someone whose expertise was valued, someone who could look at a complex system and understand exactly how to make it work. Emma had found the old photographs last year, had been looking for something in the back of Marcus's closet and discovered the box he kept hidden behind winter coats, the one containing his uniforms and commendations and the framed picture of him in dress blues shaking hands with a general after receiving an award for extraordinary technical achievement. She had asked him why he stopped being a captain, why he stopped working on airplanes, why he kept all of this hidden away like a secret he was ashamed of, and Marcus had struggled to explain that sometimes people had to give up one kind of life to make room for a different kind, that loving someone sometimes meant making sacrifices that hurt but were necessary. She had accepted the explanation but not entirely, and Marcus could see the question still living in her eyes, could sense her trying to reconcile the father she knew, the night janitor who worked hard and came home tired, with the person in those photographs who looked so different, so confident, so completely present in a way that the current version of him never quite managed. She had started checking out books about aviation from the library, had begun drawing increasingly complex mechanical diagrams, had announced her intention to enter the youth engineering competition with a project that would demonstrate principles of engine efficiency and thermodynamic conversion. Marcus had helped where he could without revealing too much of what he knew, had guided her questions in productive directions and offered suggestions framed as curiosity rather than expertise, but he could see her struggling with equipment that wasn't quite adequate and conditions that made precision work nearly impossible. The community center where the competition preparation took place had lost its engineering lab funding, leaving participants to work in a converted storage room with fluorescent lights that flickered and cast shadows, with tables that weren't level and tools that were worn from years of use by children who didn't know how to maintain them properly. Tonight, before his shift, Emma had shown him her nearly completed model, a miniature engine that could theoretically demonstrate compression cycles and heat transfer if only the components fit together precisely enough, if only she could test it properly to ensure the calibrations were correct. She had been working by the kitchen lamp, squinting at measurements, using calipers that didn't quite close properly anymore, and Marcus had watched her with his heart breaking because she reminded him so completely of Sarah in those moments, that same fierce determination to understand and create and make something beautiful out of raw materials and knowledge. "Dad," she had asked, looking up from her work with grease on her hands and hope in her eyes, "if I win this competition, I get a scholarship to the advanced summer program at the engineering academy. They have real labs there, with proper equipment and teachers who used to work for NASA and car companies. Do you think I could actually win? Do you think my project is good enough?" Marcus had knelt beside her, had looked at the model with professional eyes and seen that it was extraordinary for a 7-year-old, that it demonstrated understanding far beyond her years, but also that it was being built under impossible conditions and would never be able to compete properly against children who had access to adequate resources. He had cupped her face in his hands, those hands that used to maintain aircraft worth hundreds of millions of dollars and now pushed mops across marble floors, and had made her a promise that felt like an echo of every vow he had ever made to Sarah about protecting their daughter and giving her opportunities and never letting circumstances determine her future. "You're brilliant," he had told her, meaning every word. "And I'm going to make sure you have what you need to show everyone just how brilliant you are." Now, standing in the testing bay at 3 a.m. with his old tools spread before him and Victoria Sterling's cruel bet hanging in the balance, Marcus understood that this moment was about more than fixing a vehicle or keeping his job or proving something to people who had dismissed him without knowing anything true about who he was. This was about keeping the promise to Emma, about being able to look her in the eyes tomorrow and tell her that he had done something that mattered, that he had used the skills that had been gathering dust inside him to make her dream possible. He picked up the first tool, feeling the weight of it settle into his palm with the certainty of belonging, and turned toward the vehicle that waited for his attention. The overhead lights hummed softly in the silence, and Marcus closed his eyes for just a moment, touching the photo he kept in his wallet, the one of Sarah holding newborn Emma and smiling with such absolute love that it still hurt to look at directly. Then he opened his eyes and got to work, letting muscle memory and expertise take over, becoming once again the person he used to be before grief had redefined everything. Victoria Sterling had learned early that showing weakness was the fastest way to lose everything that mattered, a lesson delivered not through gentle teaching but through brutal demonstration, through watching power shift hands in the wake of vulnerability and understanding that control was the only currency that actually purchased security. She was 33 years old and had been running Sterling Automotive for 4 years, ever since her father Richard Sterling suffered a massive stroke during a board meeting and collapsed in front of 27 witnesses who immediately began calculating how to capitalize on the leadership vacuum. She had been 29 then, had been serving as VP of Operations with plans to eventually transition into greater responsibility over a timeline of years rather than hours, but circumstance had accelerated everything in the way that crisis always did. Her father had built Sterling Automotive from a small parts manufacturer into a multi-billion-dollar defense contractor over 30 years of ruthless business acumen and strategic partnerships, establishing relationships with military procurement offices and private security firms that generated consistent revenue streams even during economic downturns. Richard Sterling had been legendary in the industry for his ability to identify emerging technologies and acquire the companies developing them before competitors recognized their value, for his willingness to make difficult decisions without sentiment interfering with profit, and for his reputation as someone who never, ever lost a negotiation or admitted defeat. He had also been a terrible father, at least by any conventional measure, though Victoria had learned not to think of it in those terms because doing so required acknowledging pain she couldn't afford to feel. Her mother had died when Victoria was 6 years old, a brain aneurysm that struck without warning while they were having breakfast together, and Victoria's primary memories of that morning were of her mother smiling while pouring orange juice and then collapsing between one breath and the next, of calling for her father and watching him check for a pulse with the same clinical efficiency he might apply to evaluating a malfunctioning machine before calling emergency services. Richard Sterling had not remarried, had not brought nannies or surrogate parental figures into his daughter's life, had instead raised Victoria with the same principles he applied to business: efficiency, independence, and the understanding that emotional attachment made you vulnerable to manipulation. He had taught her that crying was a negotiation tactic weak people used when they had nothing substantial to offer, that needing others was a liability that gave them power over you, that love was just another word for dependency with catastrophic downside risk. She had learned to present herself with perfect control, to never let anyone see doubt or fear or the desperate loneliness that lived inside her like a second skeleton, supporting her from within while remaining invisible to external observers. The board had questioned her ability to run the company when her father's stroke left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly enough to direct operations. They had suggested an interim CEO, had mentioned names of experienced executives who could provide steady leadership during the transition, had implied without quite stating directly that a 29-year-old woman might not command the respect necessary to manage defense contracts and military relationships. Victoria had listened to their concerns with her face composed in the mask of attentive consideration she had perfected over years of board meetings, and then she had systematically dismantled their arguments and consolidated her power before any of them understood what was happening. She had called in favors, had activated relationships her father had cultivated, had demonstrated her understanding of every contract and partnership and strategic initiative in enough detail that even the skeptics had to acknowledge her competence. She had also made it clear that she was willing to be more ruthless than her father had ever been, that she would cut divisions that weren't performing, would terminate executives who questioned her authority, would pursue profit with the kind of single-minded focus that made sentiment irrelevant. Within 6 months she had doubled the company's military contract portfolio and laid off 800 workers whose positions she determined were redundant, and the board had stopped questioning her fitness for leadership. But the pressure never eased, never relented even for a moment, because Victoria understood that the instant she showed weakness or uncertainty, the instant anyone perceived vulnerability or doubt, the predators would circle and begin calculating how to remove her from power. She worked 16-hour days as standard practice, slept 4 hours per night in the penthouse apartment she maintained 3 blocks from headquarters, and had systematically eliminated any personal relationships that might compete with the demands of running the company. She had no close friends, maintained only professional contacts, and had not been in a romantic relationship since accepting the CEO position because allowing someone that close felt like providing them with weapons they could use against her. Every morning she stood in front of the mirror in her bathroom and practiced expressions, cycling through variations of confidence and authority and cold certainty, checking for any trace of the fear that lived perpetually inside her, the terror that she was inadequate, that she was failing her father's legacy, that at any moment someone would recognize that she was just pretending to be strong enough for this role and the entire carefully constructed illusion would collapse. She practiced until her face showed nothing but control, until she could look at her own reflection without seeing the lonely frightened child who had watched her mother die and learned that needing people was the fastest way to lose them. The military contract that hung in the balance tonight represented 4 years of development and $200 million in projected revenue, a next-generation autonomous transport system that could carry supplies or personnel in hostile environments without risking human drivers, reducing casualties while increasing operational efficiency. Victoria had personally overseen the acquisition of the technology startup that developed the core systems, had negotiated the military procurement meetings, had committed enormous resources to prototyping and testing on the promise that Sterling Automotive would deliver a revolutionary vehicle that could handle conditions where conventional transports failed. The demonstration for the automotive and military press was scheduled for 7 a.m., 6 hours from now when she had first arrived at headquarters to find the engineering team in crisis mode, and the thought of failing publicly after investing so much made her feel physically ill in a way she would never let show on her face. She had made the bet with the janitor not because she believed he could actually fix anything, not because she thought someone pushing a mop could possibly understand systems that baffled her specialized engineers, but because she needed to feel in control of something, needed to demonstrate dominance in a moment when everything felt like it was spinning away from her grasp. Watching him accept the bet, watching him walk away with that quiet dignity that somehow made her feel smaller rather than larger, Victoria had felt a twist of something uncomfortable in her chest that might have been shame if she allowed herself to identify it. But shame was weakness, was the kind of emotional indulgence that her father had taught her to excise from her decision-making process, so she pushed the feeling down and focused instead on the practical reality that she had just wagered 4 hours of precious time on a gesture that would probably accomplish nothing except demonstrating to her team that she was willing to try anything when faced with crisis. She returned to her office on the 40th floor, left the engineers to continue their diagnostic work, and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city lights stretched to the horizon. The office was pristine, decorated by a professional service with furniture that cost more than most people earned in a year, everything arranged to project success and power and complete control. There were no personal photographs on the desk, no mementos or decorations that might suggest she had a life outside these walls, nothing that could give anyone insight into who Victoria Sterling was when she wasn't performing the role of CEO. Sometimes, in the small hours of the morning when she was alone in this space, Victoria would look at her reflection in the dark windows and try to remember who she had been before her mother died, before her father's lessons about strength and independence had remade her into someone capable of running a multi-billion-dollar company but incapable of maintaining any relationship that required vulnerability or trust. She had vague memories of being softer once, of laughing more easily, of believing that the world was essentially good and people could be relied upon to care about each other. But those memories felt like they belonged to a different person entirely, someone who had died at the same time her mother did and been replaced by the efficient machine her father needed her to become. The phone on her desk showed 6 missed calls from her father's care facility, probably the overnight nurse trying to update her on his condition, and Victoria ignored them the way she ignored most of the reminders that Richard Sterling still existed in diminished form in an expensive memory care unit. She visited once per month, sat beside him for exactly 30 minutes while he stared at her without recognition, and then left feeling hollowed out in ways she couldn't afford to examine too closely. Her father had taught her that strength meant not needing anyone, that independence was the highest virtue, that allowing others to matter gave them power that they would inevitably use to hurt you, and now he existed in a facility surrounded by people paid to care for him, unable to remember his own daughter and perhaps finally learning what his philosophy cost. Victoria checked her watch and saw that 2 hours had passed since she had left the janitor in the testing bay, which meant he had 2 hours remaining before the press arrived and the demonstration would need to proceed or be cancelled. She had heard nothing from the engineers, no updates suggesting the situation had improved or deteriorated, and she realized with some surprise that part of her was hoping the janitor would succeed, was hoping that someone she had dismissed and mocked might actually prove capable of solving a problem that her team of specialists could not address. The thought made her uncomfortable because it suggested faith in another person, suggested allowing possibility where control dictated certainty, suggested that maybe strength wasn't always about dominance and independence but sometimes about trusting that help could come from unexpected places. But trusting people was how you got hurt, was how you became vulnerable, was how you ended up like a mother, gone in an instant and leaving behind nothing but absence and the lesson that loving anyone was just setting yourself up for inevitable loss. She turned back to the windows and watched the sun beginning to lighten the eastern horizon, watched the city wake up gradually around her, and wondered what it would feel like to be someone different, someone capable of connection rather than just control. But the thought felt dangerous, felt like the first crack in armor that kept her functioning, so Victoria pushed it away and focused instead on preparing for whatever outcome the next 2 hours would bring, confident that regardless of what happened with the vehicle or the janitor or the demonstration, she would face it with perfect control and show no weakness to anyone watching. If this story is resonating with you, hit that like button. It helps more people discover these tales of redemption and second chances. Emma Hayes was 7 years old and understood more about thermodynamics than most adults would ever learn, could explain principles of mechanical advantage with the kind of clarity that came from genuine understanding rather than memorization, but none of that changed the fact that she was still a child who missed her mother with an ache that lived permanently in her chest and sometimes felt like she might drown in the absence. She had been 4 when the accident happened, old enough to remember her mother clearly but young enough that the memories were becoming less precise with each passing year, details fading like photographs left too long in sunlight until she couldn't quite recall the exact sound of her mother's laugh or the specific smell of her hair after washing. What Emma remembered most clearly were the hours sitting at the kitchen table with her mother, working through projects that turned learning into play, building simple machines from household materials and discussing why gears meshed the way they did, why pulleys provided mechanical advantage, why understanding how things worked gave you power to create rather than just consume. Her mother had believed that everyone should understand the basic principles that govern the physical world, that knowledge was democratic and accessible rather than exclusive and mysterious, and she had taught Emma to ask questions without embarrassment, to admit ignorance without shame, to understand that not knowing something was just the first step toward learning. After her mother died, Emma had clung to those interests like a lifeline, had thrown herself into studying engineering and physics and mathematics because doing so felt like keeping her mother alive somehow, like as long as she continued asking why and how and what if, some essential part of Sarah Hayes still existed in the world. She read books far above her age level, watched educational videos about mechanical systems and thermodynamic principles, drew increasingly complex diagrams in notebooks that she filled with observations and questions and theories about how things fit together. Her father helped when he could, answered questions with the kind of precision that suggested deeper knowledge than he admitted to, but Emma could see something painful in his eyes whenever she asked about engines or aircraft or the complex systems that fascinated her most. She had found the photographs last year, had discovered the hidden box containing her father's military uniforms and commendations, had seen pictures of him standing beside complicated machinery with tools in his hands and absolute confidence in his posture, and she had understood for the first time that her father had given up something enormous when her mother died, had walked away from expertise and achievement to focus entirely on raising her alone. The realization had made her feel guilty in a way she didn't quite know how to articulate, as if her existence had cost her father his identity, as if being her parent required him to stop being the person he used to be. She had asked him about it once, late at night when they were sitting together on their small balcony watching traffic pass below their apartment, and he had told her something that she thought about often afterward. He had said that being good at something wasn't the same as that something being the most important thing, that sometimes people discovered they were capable of loving someone so much that everything else became secondary, that giving up one kind of life to make room for a better kind wasn't sacrifice, it was just choice weighted by love. Emma wasn't sure she fully believed that, wasn't sure she could accept that her father was happy mopping floors overnight when he had once been important enough to shake hands with generals, but she understood that arguing would hurt him in ways she didn't want to cause. So instead she focused on her own work, on building the kind of projects that would have made her mother proud, on proving that the hours of teaching and encouragement hadn't been wasted, on demonstrating that she understood and valued everything both her parents had tried to give her. The youth engineering competition had become the focus of all her hopes over the past 3 months, ever since her teacher had mentioned it and explained that the winner would receive a scholarship to the advanced summer program at the City Engineering Academy. Emma had visited the academy website obsessively, had studied photographs of their laboratories filled with proper equipment, their workshops with adequate lighting and level tables, their classrooms where teachers who had worked for major companies taught advanced concepts to students who wanted to learn. She had imagined herself in those spaces, had pictured having access to tools that worked properly and materials that weren't salvaged from donation bins, and the wanting had been so intense it felt like physical pressure in her chest. Her competition project was a miniature engine that demonstrated principles of internal combustion and thermodynamic efficiency, showing how controlled explosions could be converted into mechanical motion through precise timing and containment. She had designed it herself after weeks of research, had drawn schematics that her father had looked at with an expression she couldn't quite read before offering small suggestions framed as questions rather than corrections. She had built it slowly over 2 months, working in the converted storage room at the community center where the competition preparation sessions took place, struggling with inadequate lighting and worn tools and the constant frustration of knowing exactly what she needed to do but lacking the resources to execute with precision. The fluorescent lights flickered constantly, casting shadows that made fine work nearly impossible, and the tables weren't level, which meant measurements could be off by margins small enough to seem insignificant but large enough to prevent proper function. The calipers available were old and didn't quite close properly anymore. The screwdrivers had stripped heads from years of use by children who didn't know to check fit before applying torque, and the only workbench vise had jaws that didn't align correctly so anything clamped in it came out slightly twisted. Emma had adapted as best she could, had learned to compensate for the flickering lights by working during moments of relative stability, had checked and rechecked measurements to account for the unlevel tables, had improvised solutions when the proper tools weren't available. But she knew her project couldn't compete at the level it deserved, knew that children with access to proper facilities would be able to execute their designs with precision she simply couldn't achieve under these conditions, and the knowledge sat heavy and bitter in her chest like swallowed frustration. Tonight, before her father had left for work, Emma had shown him the nearly completed engine with a mixture of pride and disappointment warring in her expression. The design was sound, the theory was correct, but the execution showed all the signs of being built under impossible constraints. Components that should have fit together with perfect tolerance had small gaps, surfaces that should have been smooth showed minor imperfections from inadequate tools, and the whole assembly had a slightly makeshift quality that no amount of careful work could completely overcome. "Dad," she had asked, holding the model in both hands and feeling the weight of all her hopes concentrated in that small mechanism, "do you think it's good enough? The competition is tomorrow afternoon, and I know it works in theory, but I couldn't test it properly because I don't have the right equipment to measure pressure accurately, and I'm worried the tolerances aren't precise enough, and all the other kids from the academy program are going to have projects built in real labs with real tools and teachers helping them, and mine is just, mine." Her father had knelt beside her the way he always did when they talked about important things, getting down to her eye level rather than looming above, and Emma had seen something complicated in his face, something that looked like pain and pride mixed together in proportions she couldn't measure. He had taken the engine from her hands gently, had examined it with the kind of attention that suggested he was seeing things she hadn't intended to show, and then he had looked at her with such intensity that she almost couldn't maintain eye contact. "Emma, listen to me very carefully," he had said, his voice carrying weight that made each word feel significant. "This engine that you designed and built yourself while working in terrible conditions with inadequate tools? This is extraordinary. You're 7 years old and you understand thermodynamic principles that most adults never learn. You drew these schematics yourself, you calculated these measurements, you figured out how to make things work even when you didn't have proper equipment. That's not just good enough. That's remarkable." But the other kids, Emma had started to protest, and her father had gently placed his finger against her lips, stopping the words. "The other kids have advantages you don't have right now. Better facilities, better tools, teachers with more time to help them. Those advantages matter, and it's not fair that you don't have access to the same resources. But Emma, you need to understand something important. The person who builds something beautiful with perfect tools and ideal conditions is doing good work. But the person who builds something beautiful despite obstacles and limitations? That person is demonstrating something more valuable. That person is showing that they understand not just how things should work, but how to make things work even when conditions aren't ideal. And that's the skill that actually matters in the real world." Emma had felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, that burning pressure that came before crying, and she had blinked rapidly because she didn't want to seem like a baby, didn't want her father to think she couldn't handle disappointment. But he had seen anyway, had pulled her into a hug that felt safe and solid and reminded her that even though her mother was gone, she wasn't alone, that someone still loved her enough to make her dreams matter more than anything else. "I'm going to make sure you have what you need tomorrow," her father had said quietly, his voice muffled slightly by her hair as he held her close. "I promise you, Emma. You're going to go into that competition with your head held high, and you're going to show everyone what you're capable of, and whatever happens after that, you'll know that you had a fair chance to demonstrate your brilliance." Emma had wanted to ask what he meant, how he could possibly provide resources they didn't have money to afford, why he sounded so certain when everything about their circumstances suggested otherwise. But she had learned that her father kept promises, that when he said he would do something, he found a way to make it happen even if it required sacrifice she didn't fully understand. So she had simply nodded against his chest and trusted that somehow, he would keep his word the way he always did. Now it was past midnight, and Emma was supposed to be sleeping, tucked into her bed in the small room she had decorated with drawings of engines and aircraft and mechanical systems that fascinated her. But she couldn't quite settle, couldn't stop thinking about tomorrow afternoon when she would present her project to judges who would compare it against work done by children with every possible advantage. She got out of bed quietly, padding in bare feet to her father's room where she knew he wouldn't be because he was at work, and she opened the closet where she knew the hidden box lived behind his winter coats. She had looked at the photographs before, but tonight she studied them with new attention, trying to understand who her father had been before she existed, before her mother died, before circumstances had transformed him into someone different. The pictures showed a younger version of him in Air Force dress blues, standing at attention with medals on his chest and pride in his posture, shaking hands with officers who wore stars on their shoulders. There were action shots too, her father in work coveralls standing beside massive aircraft with tools in his hands, pointing at something on an engine while other men in similar uniforms looked on with expressions of respect and attention. Emma traced her finger over one photograph where her father stood in front of a fighter jet, his hand resting on the fuselage with easy familiarity, and she tried to imagine what it must have felt like to work on machines that complex, to have expertise that valuable, to be the person others looked to when something critical needed fixing. She thought about how he must have given all of that up when her mother died, how he must have walked away from everything that made him important and respected because taking care of her was more important than any job or achievement or recognition. The weight of that sacrifice pressed down on her small shoulders, making her feel simultaneously loved beyond measure and guilty for costing her father so much. She carefully returned the photographs to their box, pushed the box back behind the coats exactly where she had found it, and went back to her own room where her competition engine sat on her desk illuminated by the small lamp she used for studying. She picked it up carefully, turning it in her hands, seeing both what it was and what it could have been if circumstances had been different. "I'll make you proud, Dad," she whispered to the empty room, to the father who was somewhere across the city keeping a promise she didn't fully understand yet. "I'll show them what I can do, and I'll make it count. I promise." She set the engine back on her desk and climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin and closing her eyes against the thoughts that wanted to spiral into worry and doubt. Tomorrow would come regardless of whether she slept, and when it did, she would do what her parents had both taught her to do: show up, work hard, demonstrate understanding, and trust that being brilliant was enough even when resources weren't equal. She fell asleep thinking about her mother's laugh and her father's promises and the engine that contained all her hopes, and she dreamed of laboratories full of light and possibility where she could build anything she imagined. Marcus worked with the focused intensity of someone who had done this kind of repair hundreds of times before, his hands moving through diagnostic sequences and corrective procedures with muscle memory that 7 years away from professional work hadn't erased. The prototype vehicle dominated the center of the testing bay, all sleek lines and advanced technology, but underneath the sophisticated exterior it was still just a machine, still governed by the same fundamental principles of pressure and flow and mechanical advantage that Marcus had internalized over a career spent maintaining systems where failure meant death. He had started with a visual inspection, circling the vehicle slowly while his eyes catalogued every detail, every component and connection point, looking for the obvious problems before moving to the subtle ones. The pneumatic system that powered the hybrid drivetrain was a masterwork of engineering, combining compressed air storage with electric motors to provide both efficiency and power redundancy, the kind of system that could keep operating even if one component failed completely. But somewhere in that elegant design, something had seized or misaligned or failed to calibrate correctly, leaving the entire vehicle inoperable with a press demonstration approaching and $200 million hanging in the balance. Marcus checked his watch and noted the timestamp: 3:47 a.m., 3 hours and 13 minutes until the automotive press would arrive, expecting to see a functional demonstration. He retrieved the technical manual from the observation room, a 300-page document that detailed every system and subsystem in exhaustive detail, and he skimmed through it quickly, his eyes picking out the critical information while discarding the routine specifications he could already infer from observation. The manual confirmed what he had suspected: the pneumatic system operated at extremely high pressures with minimal tolerance for error, which meant that any misalignment or contamination or pressure irregularity could cascade into complete system failure. He opened his toolkit and selected a precision pressure gauge, one he had calibrated himself years ago and maintained obsessively even when he had no reason to believe he would ever use it again. The gauge connected to the system's primary test port with a satisfying click that spoke of precision manufacturing and proper threading, and Marcus watched the needle swing as he opened the valve and allowed pressure to register. The reading was immediately wrong, showing pressure 20% below the specified operating range, which explained why the system wouldn't initialize but didn't explain why the pressure was low in the first place. Marcus traced the pneumatic lines backward from the actuator assembly, following the logic of flow and storage and compression, checking connection points and valve seats and filter housings with systematic thoroughness. He found the first problem at the main reservoir: a pressure sensor had failed and was sending incorrect readings to the control computer, which had responded by shutting down the compression system to prevent what it interpreted as catastrophic overpressure. The sensor was a small component, easily replaced, but accessing it required partial disassembly of the housing assembly and careful work to avoid damaging the seals that maintained system integrity. He worked steadily, removing bolts with the correct torque specifications to avoid stripping threads, labeling components as he disconnected them so reassembly would follow proper sequence, setting each piece aside with care that spoke of understanding that even small parts mattered in complex systems. The failed sensor came free after 15 minutes of careful work, and Marcus held it up to the light, examining the corrosion visible on the contact points that suggested moisture contamination at some point during testing. He set it aside and retrieved the replacement from the parts inventory, checking the specification numbers twice before installing to ensure compatibility, torquing the mounting bolts to exact values because over-tightening could crack the housing while under-tightening could allow vibration damage. The timestamp read 4:23 a.m. when he finished replacing the sensor, 2 hours and 37 minutes remaining, and Marcus moved to the next problem without pausing. The system wouldn't simply resume operation because the sensor was replaced. The control computer had logged a critical fault and gone into lockdown mode, which required manual reset through diagnostic protocols that weren't documented in the user manual because they were considered proprietary engineering access. But Marcus had worked with similar systems during his Air Force career, had learned from master technicians who understood that real troubleshooting required going beyond what manuals specified and understanding the underlying logic of how designers thought when they created fail-safe systems. He connected a diagnostic tablet to the vehicle's primary computer interface and navigated through several layers of protected menus until he found the fault log, a scrolling list of error codes and timestamps that documented every irregular reading the system had encountered during the failed calibration. Marcus scanned through the codes with practice speed, his training allowing him to translate the numeric sequences into plain language understanding of what had happened and in what order. The pressure sensor failure had occurred first, but then secondary failures had cascaded as the computer shut down systems in response to what it interpreted as catastrophic malfunction, and several actuators had seized in closed positions, trapping pneumatic pressure in sections of the system that couldn't vent properly. The seized actuators were the real problem, Marcus realized, because simply replacing the sensor and resetting the computer wouldn't clear the trapped pressure or free the actuators, which meant the system would immediately fault again when initialization was attempted. He needed to manually vent the trapped pressure and physically free each seized actuator, work that was delicate and potentially dangerous because releasing high-pressure pneumatic systems incorrectly could result in explosive decompression that might damage components or cause injury. Marcus paused for a moment, his hands resting on the vehicle's frame, and allowed himself to acknowledge the irony of this situation. He had walked away from professional mechanical work because grief had made him unable to focus, had convinced himself that he couldn't be trusted with systems where mistakes had consequences, and now he was alone in a testing bay working on a $50 million prototype with hours until deadline and no backup if he made an error. But somehow his hands were steady, his mind was clear, and the work felt right in a way that nothing had felt right in 7 years, like he was finally allowing himself to be who he actually was rather than who he had forced himself to become. He thought of Emma, pictured her sleeping peacefully in their apartment with her competition engine on her desk, and he felt renewed focus flow through him like electricity finding ground. This wasn't about proving anything to Victoria Sterling or her engineering team or the crowd of executives who had laughed at him. This was about keeping his promise to his daughter, about ensuring she would have the resources and opportunities she deserved, about demonstrating through action rather than words that love sometimes meant doing difficult things in impossible circumstances because the alternative was accepting that the people you loved should have less than they needed. The venting procedure required precise sequences to avoid shocking the system, and Marcus worked through it methodically, cracking valves incrementally while monitoring pressure gauges, listening for the hiss of compressed air escaping in controlled fashion, feeling for vibrations that might indicate turbulent flow or stuck components. The first actuator freed after 10 minutes of patient work, the mechanism sliding back to neutral position with a satisfying click that confirmed proper function. The second took longer, required gentle persuasion with a rubber mallet to break corrosion that had formed during the extended seized period, but eventually it too released and returned to specification. The timestamp read 5:41 a.m. when Marcus finished venting the trapped pressure and freeing all the seized actuators, 1 hour and 19 minutes until the press arrived, and he permitted himself 30 seconds to simply breathe and assess before moving into the final phase. The testing bay was silent except for the hum of ventilation and the occasional metallic tick of components adjusting to temperature changes, and Marcus found the silence comforting in the way that solitary work had always been comforting, just himself and a machine and the straightforward logic of diagnosis and repair. He reassembled the components he had disassembled, working backward through his documented sequence, checking each connection twice before moving to the next, applying thread sealant where specifications required it, torquing bolts with the precision pressure gauge calibrated specifically for that purpose. The work was meditative in its focus, requiring complete attention but not conscious thought, allowing his hands and training to guide action while his mind existed in that quiet space where problems had solutions and solutions had specific implementations and nothing was personal or emotional, just mechanical and clear. The final connection secured at 6:07 a.m., 53 minutes remaining, and Marcus stepped back to survey the completed work. The vehicle looked unchanged from external perspective, but he knew that underneath the pristine exterior every component was now properly aligned, properly pressurized, properly configured to function as the designers had intended. He returned to the diagnostic tablet and initiated the system initialization sequence, watching status indicators cycle through their startup routines, monitoring for any fault codes or irregular readings that might suggest he had missed something critical. The pressure built steadily in the pneumatic reservoir, the compressor engaging with a smooth vibration that spoke of proper operation, and Marcus watched the gauge climb from 0 to operating range over the course of 3 minutes. The actuators responded to test signals, extending and retracting in smooth coordinated motion, and the hybrid drive system powered up without error codes or warnings. The diagnostic screen showed green status indicators across every monitored system, and Marcus allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction that had nothing to do with Victoria Sterling or her bet and everything to do with the simple pleasure of work done correctly. He shut down the initialization sequence and powered the vehicle back to standby mode, then spent the remaining 4 to 5 minutes cleaning his tools and returning them to their proper places in his toolkit, removing any trace that he had been present except for the functioning vehicle that sat ready for demonstration. He wiped down surfaces he had touched, collected the failed pressure sensor to include in his report of what had been done, and organized his documentation so that anyone examining it would understand exactly what repairs had been performed and why. When the testing bay doors opened at 6:52 a.m., 8 minutes before the press was scheduled to arrive, Marcus was standing beside the vehicle in his janitor's uniform with his toolkit at his feet and his hands folded calmly in front of him. Victoria Sterling entered first, followed by her engineering team and several executives, all of them showing various degrees of exhaustion and stress from a night spent believing their demonstration was doomed. They stopped when they saw him, a tableau of frozen surprise, and Marcus watched Victoria's expression cycle through disbelief and confusion before settling into carefully controlled neutrality. "It's fixed," Marcus said simply, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the large space. The primary pressure sensor had failed due to moisture contamination, which caused the control computer to shut down the compression system and triggered a cascade of secondary failures as actuators seized with trapped pressure. "I replaced the sensor, manually vented the trapped pressure, freed the seized actuators, and reinitialized the system. Everything is functioning within specification now. You can run your demonstration." There were more stories like this one waiting for you. Check the description box below for links to similar journeys of hidden worth and unexpected love. The press arrived exactly at 7 a.m. as scheduled, a contingent of automotive journalists and military procurement observers and industry analysts who represented the audience Victoria needed to impress if Sterling Automotive was going to secure the contracts that justified 4 years of development investment. They gathered in the observation gallery overlooking the testing bay, accepting coffee and pastries while Victoria's team distributed information packets and prepared the demonstration sequence, and Marcus stood off to one side in his janitor's uniform, watching the machinery of corporate performance unfold with the detachment of someone no longer invested in the outcome beyond his immediate purpose. Victoria had said nothing to him directly after his announcement that the vehicle was repaired, had simply nodded once with an expression that might have been respect or might have been calculation, and then had turned to her engineering team to verify his work before allowing the demonstration to proceed. The chief engineer had run through diagnostic sequences with increasing amazement visible on his face, had checked pressure readings and actuator response and system logs with the thoroughness of someone who couldn't quite believe what he was seeing, and had finally turned to Victoria and confirmed that yes, everything was indeed functioning perfectly. The janitor had somehow accomplished what the entire specialized team had failed to achieve. The demonstration itself was technically impressive, the prototype vehicle moving through its program sequences with smooth precision, navigating obstacle courses and demonstrating autonomous operation that drew appreciative murmurs from the watching audience. Marcus recognized several moments where the repairs he had performed were critical to success, points where actuator response or pressure regulation made the difference between elegant function and catastrophic failure, but to the observers those moments passed without notice because properly functioning systems were invisible, only becoming remarkable when they failed. When the demonstration concluded to enthusiastic applause, Victoria took the podium in the observation gallery and delivered remarks about Sterling Automotive's commitment to innovation and technical excellence, about the next-generation capabilities the prototype represented, about partnerships with military procurement that would ensure American service members had access to the best possible equipment. She spoke with confidence and authority, her earlier stress completely invisible now that crisis had been averted, and Marcus wondered if anyone else in the room understood how close everything had come to disaster, how much was riding on a janitor's hidden expertise applied during desperate hours before dawn. As the press gathered their equipment and prepared to depart, several of them approaching Victoria for additional questions and photo opportunities, Marcus collected his toolkit and moved toward the exit, intending to simply disappear back into his normal overnight routine and resume the invisible work that defined his public identity. But Victoria's voice stopped him before he reached the door, cutting through the ambient conversation with the particular clarity of someone accustomed to being heard. "Mr. Hayes. A moment, please." Marcus turned slowly, his toolkit heavy in his hand, and found Victoria approaching with her executive presence slightly softened by something in her expression that he couldn't quite identify. The press had departed, the observation gallery had emptied, and it was just the two of them now with the prototype vehicle visible through the windows behind them, that machine that represented both technical achievement and the cruel bet that had brought Marcus into this situation. "You fixed my car," Victoria said, and there was something in how she said it that suggested the words meant more than their literal content. "You diagnosed a problem that baffled my entire engineering team, you performed repairs that should have required specialized knowledge and training, and you completed everything within the impossible timeframe I specified. I believe I owe you double your salary for a year, per the terms of our agreement." Marcus set down his toolkit and looked at her directly, meeting her eyes with the kind of steadiness that came from having nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose. "I don't want double my salary, Miss Sterling. I don't want a promotion or recognition or any of the things you were offering. I told you what I wanted: help for my daughter, access to resources she needs to compete fairly in her engineering competition. That's all I'm asking for." Victoria's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise or might have been shame, and she nodded slowly. "Tell me specifically what she needs." "Emma is competing in the youth engineering competition this afternoon," Marcus said, keeping his voice level and factual. "She's been preparing for 3 months, building a demonstration engine in the storage room at the community center because their engineering lab lost funding. She's been working with broken tools and inadequate lighting at tables that aren't level, doing extraordinary work under impossible conditions. The competition offers scholarships to the Advanced Summer Program at the City Engineering Academy, opportunities for kids from underserved communities to access proper facilities and instruction. Emma deserves that chance. But she needs some basic things to have a fair shot at demonstrating what she's capable of." "Such as?" "The competition allows participants to make final adjustments before presenting to judges. Emma needs access to a proper workshop for 2 hours this morning, somewhere with adequate lighting and precision tools and a level work surface. She needs someone who can verify her measurements are accurate and help her test her engine under controlled conditions. That's it. Not money, not equipment to keep, just temporary access to the kind of basic resources that kids from wealthier families take for granted." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful in a way that suggested she was processing more than just the immediate request. "Your daughter is 7 years old and she's building demonstration engines. Her mother was a science teacher. She started teaching Emma engineering principles before she could read. When her mother died, Emma held on to those interests like they were the last connection she had. Now she's 7 and drawing schematics and asking questions about thermodynamic efficiency, and I watch her work by inadequate light with broken tools and I see her mother's brilliance trapped in circumstances that aren't fair." "What was your military specialty, Mr. Hayes?" Victoria asked, and Marcus felt his throat tighten because the question opened doors he had kept closed for 7 years. "I was an Air Force maintenance officer. I specialized in complex aircraft systems, the kind where failure means people die. I was good at it. And then my wife died and I couldn't focus anymore, couldn't trust myself not to miss something critical because I was drowning in grief, so I walked away and took a job that wouldn't put lives at risk if I made mistakes. This job. Pushing a mop. Going invisible. Being someone different." "You didn't fail tonight," Victoria said quietly. "You succeeded where specialists failed. You demonstrated expertise that saved my company from disaster. That's not someone who can't be trusted." Marcus picked up his toolkit, feeling the weight of all his old tools, all his old identity contained in that case. "Tonight was for Emma, not for me. I don't need to prove I can still do the work. I just need to keep my promise to my daughter that she'll have what she needs to show people how brilliant she is." Victoria pulled out her phone and made a call, speaking quickly and precisely into the device while Marcus stood waiting. "This is Victoria Sterling. I need you to open the engineering development lab immediately and prepare it for a special project. We'll have a young participant arriving within 2 hours who needs access to precision equipment and proper facilities. Yes, full access. Assign someone from the senior engineering team to provide technical support. This is priority 1. She ended the call and turned back to Marcus, extending a business card that he accepted with careful fingers. "This is the address of our development facility. It's 15 minutes from here. Bring your daughter at 9 a.m., and she'll have access to our laboratory for as long as she needs. We have equipment that makes what's available at the engineering academy look inadequate. One of my senior engineers will be there to help her verify measurements and test her engine properly. Tell her to take her time and do the work right. Marcus looked at the card, at the embossed letters and the address that represented exactly what Emma needed, and felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. Thank you. This means everything to her. Mr. Hayes, Victoria said, and her voice carried something that hadn't been present during their earlier interaction, something that sounded like respect earned rather than demanded. I made a cruel bet last night because I was terrified of failing publicly and I needed to feel in control of something. I humiliated you in front of witnesses because showing dominance was easier than admitting vulnerability. You had every right to refuse, to walk away, to let me face the consequences of my own leadership failures. But you didn't. You accepted humiliation and impossible conditions because you loved your daughter enough to endure anything for her sake. That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing I've ever witnessed. Marcus met her eyes and saw something different there than he had seen in the harsh lobby lighting at 3 a.m., something that suggested the armor was cracking slightly and the person underneath might be capable of understanding what strength actually meant. I'll bring Emma at 9. And Miss Sterling? Thank you for keeping your word. Not everyone does. He walked out of the testing bay into the morning light, carrying his toolkit and feeling lighter than he had in years, as if some burden he hadn't known he was carrying had finally been set down. The city was waking around him, traffic building on the streets and people heading to work and the world continuing its routine indifferent to the small miracles that happened in testing bays before dawn. Marcus pulled out his phone and called Emma, knowing she would be awake and anxious about her competition, ready to tell her that promises kept were real and that sometimes asking for help resulted in resources beyond what anyone expected. Dad. Her voice was small and hopeful on the other end of the line. Is everything okay? Everything is perfect, sweetheart, Marcus said, and meant it with an honesty that surprised him. Get your competition engine ready. We're going somewhere special this morning, somewhere with real lights and real tools and someone who's going to help you make sure everything works perfectly. I told you I'd keep my promise. I told you I'd make sure you had what you needed. Emma's squeal of delight was loud enough that Marcus had to hold the phone away from his ear, and he found himself smiling with genuine joy for the first time since Sarah died, feeling like maybe, finally, he was doing something right, was being the parent Emma needed, was honoring both Sarah's memory and Emma's potential in ways that mattered more than any job or achievement or recognition. He hailed a taxi to take him home, too tired to wait for the bus, and spent the ride thinking about how strange it was that humiliation could turn into opportunity, that crisis could reveal character, that the worst night in years might somehow become the beginning of something better. If you're invested in seeing how this ends, subscribe so you never miss a story. These tales of falling and rising again come out regularly. Victoria Sterling stood alone in her office after Marcus Hayes departed, watching dawn spread gold across the city skyline, and felt the careful architecture of her self-image developing cracks that threatened to become structural failures if she examined them too closely. She had built her identity on principles her father taught her, on the belief that strength meant dominance and vulnerability meant weakness and allowing others to matter gave them power they would inevitably use to hurt you. But standing in that testing bay watching a janitor refuse recognition and request only resources for his daughter, watching someone demonstrate the kind of selfless love she had convinced herself was naive and impractical, Victoria found herself questioning foundations she had never before examined. Her phone showed missed calls from the care facility where her father existed in diminished form, and for once Victoria actually answered when they called back, speaking with the overnight nurse who provided updates she usually ignored. Richard Sterling had been agitated during the night, the nurse explained, had been calling for someone named Victoria, had seemed distressed in ways that the medication couldn't fully address, and did Victoria want to schedule a visit outside her normal monthly routine? Victoria surprised herself by saying yes, by clearing her calendar for that afternoon, by acknowledging that maybe avoiding her father's decay wasn't strength but rather cowardice disguised as efficiency. She pulled up Marcus Hayes's employee file, really examined it for the first time rather than just glancing at the surface information, and saw the careful absence of details that suggested a past deliberately obscured. He had listed no previous employment before Sterling Automotive, had provided no professional references, had simply appeared 7 years ago requesting the overnight custodial position and accepting it without negotiation when offered. The file contained only basic information, current address and emergency contact and performance reviews that consistently rated him as reliable and thorough but never exceptional, the kind of employee who did his work competently and disappeared into the background noise of operations. But Victoria knew now that the absence of information was itself information, that someone who could perform the kind of sophisticated repairs Marcus had accomplished last night would have records and credentials and a professional history that explained expertise acquired through years of training and practice. She made a call to a private investigator she sometimes used for background checks on potential partnerships, someone discreet and thorough who specialized in finding information people preferred to keep hidden. "I need everything you can find on Marcus Hayes," she said, spelling the name and providing the limited details from his employee file. "Military service is likely, probably Air Force based on his technical knowledge. Start with Defense Department databases and work backward. I need to know who he was before he became invisible." The investigator promised results within 48 hours, and Victoria ended the call feeling slightly guilty for violating Marcus's privacy while simultaneously convinced that understanding his background was necessary for reasons she couldn't quite articulate. She told herself it was professional due diligence, verification that he posed no security risk given his access to proprietary systems, but underneath the justification was simple curiosity about someone who had demonstrated character in ways that made her own carefully constructed persona feel hollow and performative. The board meeting scheduled for 10 a.m. required her attention. Preparations for quarterly earnings reports and strategic discussions about contract negotiations, the routine machinery of corporate leadership that consumed Victoria's days and gave her purpose that felt increasingly empty. She reviewed projections and financial models and competitive analyses with the same focused intensity she had always applied to business operations, but part of her mind kept returning to that moment in the testing bay when Marcus had refused her offer of money and promotion, when he had stated so clearly that external recognition meant nothing compared to his daughter's needs. Victoria had no children, had never seriously considered parenthood because doing so would require vulnerability, independence, and trusting another person in ways that terrified her more than any business risk. She had watched colleagues struggle with work-life balance, had seen careers derailed by family obligations, had absorbed her father's teaching that personal attachments were liabilities that diluted focus and compromised performance. But watching Marcus talk about his daughter with such absolute certainty that her needs superseded everything else made Victoria wonder what it would feel like to love someone that completely, to have purpose that existed independent of achievement or recognition or external validation. The investigator called back sooner than expected, at 8:47 a.m. while Victoria was reviewing documents in preparation for the board meeting, and his voice carried the particular tone of someone who had found information that exceeded expectations. "Miss Sterling, you were right about military service, but the scope is beyond what you suggested. Marcus Hayes wasn't just Air Force, he was an officer in an elite maintenance division that supported special operations. His technical clearances were extremely high level, and his service record shows multiple commendations for extraordinary technical achievement under combat conditions." Victoria set down the document she had been reading and gave the phone her complete attention. "Go on." "Captain Marcus Hayes served 11 years before taking early separation with honorable discharge. The cited reason was personal family matter, but the timeline corresponds with the death of his wife in an automobile accident. Sarah Hayes was killed by a drunk driver while Marcus was deployed, and he was granted emergency leave to return home. He submitted his resignation 6 months later and separated from service despite strong recommendations that he continue. Since separation, he's had no professional employment matching his military expertise. He's been working as a custodial employee at your company for 7 years. Victoria felt something cold settle in her chest, a growing understanding of exactly what she had done when she made her cruel bet in the lobby at 3 a.m. What kind of commendations? He saved the lives of an entire flight crew when a cargo aircraft experienced critical hydraulic failure during a combat zone landing. He diagnosed and temporarily repaired complex systems while under fire, allowing the crew to evacuate safely before the aircraft was destroyed. He's received recognition for similar technical achievements multiple times, always in high-pressure situations where his expertise meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. By all accounts, Captain Hayes was considered one of the best maintenance officers in his generation. And I humiliated him in front of witnesses by offering to double his janitor salary if he could fix my car," Victoria said quietly, the weight of her own cruelty landing with devastating precision. "Oh. Nothing. Send me the complete file. Everything you found." Victoria ended the call and sat in silence, staring at the financial projections on her desk without seeing numbers or charts or any of the information they contained. She had taken someone whose courage had saved lives, whose expertise had earned respect from people who understood excellence, whose sacrifice of career for family demonstrated character she couldn't begin to match, and she had turned him into entertainment, had made him a punchline, had treated him like someone whose worth was measured in how thoroughly she could demonstrate her own superiority. The investigator's email arrived with documentation that made everything worse. Photographs of a younger Marcus in dress uniform looking confident and purposeful, after-action reports describing his technical achievements in language that spoke of genuine heroism, letters of recommendation from commanders who praised both his skill and his character. Victoria read through the materials with growing shame, seeing the trajectory of a life that had been promising and meaningful until tragedy had intervened, understanding that Marcus hadn't failed or given up but had consciously chosen to prioritize his daughter over everything else that society defined as important or valuable. There was a photograph near the end of the file, Marcus standing with a woman who was clearly Sarah and holding a toddler who must have been Emma, all three of them smiling with the uncomplicated happiness of people who didn't yet know how quickly everything could be taken away. Victoria stared at Sarah's face, at the joy visible in her expression, and tried to imagine what it must have been like for Marcus to lose that, to have his entire world reduced to ashes in a single moment of random violence, to have to continue living and working and raising a daughter while carrying that absence. She thought about her own mother's death, about being 6 years old and watching her collapse without warning, about her father's cold efficiency in managing the crisis and teaching her that grief was weakness and attachment was vulnerability. She thought about how she had internalized those lessons, had built an identity on the foundation of never needing anyone, never allowing anyone to matter enough that losing them could break her. And she realized with sudden clarity that Marcus had experienced the same kind of devastating loss but had responded completely differently, had allowed grief to exist while still finding purpose in loving his daughter, had demonstrated that strength wasn't about preventing pain but about continuing despite it, about choosing to remain capable of love even when loss had proven how much love could cost. Victoria stood and walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass and closing her eyes against the view that usually made her feel powerful and in control. She was 33 years old and ran a multi-billion-dollar company, commanded respect from boards and investors and military procurement offices, lived in a penthouse apartment filled with expensive furniture, and had absolutely nothing in her life that mattered the way Emma clearly mattered to Marcus. She had built success on the ruins of connection, had achieved everything her father taught her to value, and standing here now with the weight of her cruelty toward Marcus pressing down on her chest, Victoria understood for the first time that she had been measuring worth with the wrong instruments entirely. The board meeting pulled her back to performance, required her to present projections and strategic initiatives with the confidence that stakeholders expected, and Victoria moved through the presentation with practiced competence while part of her mind remained in the testing bay watching Marcus refuse recognition and ask only for his daughter to have a fair chance. The board approved her recommendations, praised her leadership during the prototype crisis, commented favorably on the successful press demonstration, and Victoria accepted their approval with the hollow satisfaction of someone who recognized that external validation was becoming insufficient to sustain the person she had built herself into becoming. After the meeting concluded, Victoria returned to her office and made the call she should have made years ago, scheduling a session with a therapist who specialized in executive leadership and the particular mental health challenges that came with high-pressure positions. She had always dismissed therapy as something for people who couldn't handle stress, had internalized her father's teaching that seeking help was admitting weakness, but watching Marcus demonstrate strength through vulnerability rather than dominance had made her question whether her definitions had been backwards all along. The afternoon found her driving to the care facility where her father existed in diminished form, moving through sterile corridors to the memory care unit where Richard Sterling spent his days in confusion that no medication could fully address. She found him in his room, sitting in a chair by the window and staring at nothing, his once commanding presence reduced to frailty and disorientation, and Victoria felt her throat tighten with complicated emotions she had spent years refusing to acknowledge. "Hello, Father," she said quietly, sitting in the chair beside him and taking his hand with a gentleness she hadn't shown him since before her mother died. Richard turned to look at her, his eyes clouded with confusion, and for a moment Victoria saw no recognition in his expression. Then something flickered, some fragment of memory surfacing briefly, and he squeezed her hand with surprising strength. "Victoria. You came." "I came. I'm sorry I haven't been here more often. I've been." She paused, trying to find words for the excuse she usually offered, the justification about work and responsibilities and limited time. But sitting here holding her father's diminished hand, Victoria found she couldn't complete the familiar lie. "I've been afraid. Of seeing you like this, of confronting what time does to everyone, of acknowledging that the person who taught me everything I know about strength is now completely vulnerable." Richard's expression shifted, confusion giving way to something that might have been lucidity or might have been wishful interpretation on Victoria's part. "Did I teach you wrong?" he asked, his voice thin and uncertain in ways it had never been when he ran the company. "Your mother? I couldn't protect her. And after she was gone, I didn't know how to be what you needed. So I taught you to be strong, to never need anyone, to never be vulnerable to loss. Did I teach you wrong? Victoria felt tears burning at the corners of her eyes, that sensation she had trained herself to suppress through years of practice, through countless sessions standing in front of mirrors practicing expressions of control. But here in this quiet room with her diminished father and no one watching except someone who couldn't judge her anymore, Victoria allowed the tears to come, allowed herself to acknowledge the pain of a childhood spent learning to equate emotional distance with safety. I met someone today, father. A man who lost his wife the same way I lost mother, sudden and random and devastating. But instead of teaching his daughter to never need anyone, he walked away from everything that made him important so he could be present for her. He gave up his career, his recognition, his identity, everything society defines as valuable. And when I humiliated him publicly, when I made him a spectacle for my own ego, he responded by asking only that his daughter have resources to pursue her dreams. He demonstrated more strength in that single request than I've shown in my entire tenure running your company. Richard was quiet for a long moment, his hands still holding Victoria's with that surprising strength. What was strong about asking for help? Because he put his daughter's needs above his pride. Because he endured humiliation without complaint for the sake of someone he loved. Because he understood that being a good parent sometimes means being vulnerable, being present, being willing to sacrifice recognition for connection. You taught me the opposite, father. You taught me that needing anyone was weakness, that independence was the highest virtue, that love was just dependency with catastrophic downside risk. And I've built my entire life on those principles, and tonight I realize they've left me with everything you defined as success and nothing that actually matters. I was wrong, Richard said, and his voice carried a clarity that seemed impossible given his usual confusion. After your mother died, I was terrified of feeling that much pain again. So I taught you to never be vulnerable, to never need anyone, to never allow anyone to matter enough that losing them could break you. But Victoria, that's not strength. That's just fear disguised as control. And I'm sorry I passed that fear to you and called it wisdom. Victoria broke then, crying in a way she hadn't allowed herself to cry since she was 6 years old and watching her mother being loaded into an ambulance, crying for all the years of careful distance, for all the relationships she had refused to develop, for all the moments when she had chosen control over connection and congratulated herself for being strong. Her father held her hand through it, this diminished version of the man who had shaped her understanding of the world, and Victoria felt something fundamental shifting inside her, some realization that perhaps it wasn't too late to learn different definitions, to build different priorities, to become someone capable of the kind of love Marcus demonstrated when he put Emma's needs above everything else. When the tears finally subsided, Victoria sat quietly with her father while afternoon light slanted through the windows and painted the institutional room with warmth that softened its clinical edges. I'm going to come more often, father. Not once a month as obligation, but regularly because you're my father and despite everything, I love you. And I'm going to try to learn what you're realizing now, before time runs out and leaves me with nothing but success I built at the cost of everything that actually matters. Richard nodded slowly, his lucidity already beginning to fade back into the confusion that was his normal state, but his hand squeezed hers once more with certainty. Be better than I was, Victoria. Choose love over control. Choose connection over independence. Choose being human over being strong. Victoria left the care facility as evening approached, driving back toward the city with her father's words echoing in her mind and her understanding of herself fundamentally altered by a single day's revelations. She thought about Marcus and Emma, about the relationship they had built despite grief and limited resources and circumstances that would have broken people who defined strength the way Victoria had always defined it. And she made a decision that her father would have questioned but her better self recognized as necessary. She was going to find ways to help not just Emma but Marcus, to make amends for cruelty that couldn't be undone but could perhaps be balanced with actions that demonstrated she was capable of learning, capable of changing, capable of recognizing worth in places she had been trained to dismiss. The city lights were beginning to sparkle as Victoria drove through familiar streets, and for the first time in years she noticed them not as markers of achievement or territory controlled but as evidence of lives being lived, of people going home to families and relationships and connections that mattered more than any quarterly earnings report. She thought about her empty penthouse waiting for her, about the expensive furniture and the sterile design and the complete absence of anything that suggested a person rather than a performance lived there. And Victoria Sterling, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, master of control and independence, found herself wondering what it would feel like to have someone matter enough that their needs became more important than maintaining perfect armor, to have purpose that existed independent of achievement or recognition or the desperate need to never appear vulnerable. She didn't have answers yet, but for the first time in her adult life, Victoria found herself willing to sit with the questions rather than dismissing them as irrelevant to the business of being successful. And that willingness felt like the beginning of something that might eventually become the kind of strength Marcus had demonstrated in the testing bay, the kind her father was recognizing too late, the kind that came not from never falling but from choosing to remain human even after life had given you every reason to become something harder and colder and infinitely more lonely. Emma Hayes stood in Sterling Automotive's Engineering Development Laboratory at 9:15 a.m. wearing her best dress and clutching her competition engine like it contained all her hopes compressed into mechanism and metal, and her eyes were wide with wonder at the space that surrounded her with promise and possibility. The laboratory was enormous, easily 50 feet on each side, with high ceilings and lighting that didn't flicker, with work tables that sat perfectly level and tool chests organized with labels and precision instruments still in their calibrated packaging. Along one wall stood computer stations with modeling software, along another were testing stations with equipment Emma had only seen in online videos, and in the center of the space waited a senior engineer who introduced himself as David and knelt to her level with genuine interest visible in his expression. Marcus watched his daughter's face transform as she took in the space, watched years of working in inadequate conditions give way to understanding that this was what proper facilities looked like, this was what children in wealthy communities had access to routinely, this was the standard she had been competing against while working by flickering fluorescent lights on unlevel tables with broken tools. He felt his throat tighten with gratitude and residual anger, grateful that Victoria had kept her word and provided this access, angry that it required extraordinary circumstances for his brilliant daughter to have what should have been basic educational infrastructure. Emma, David said gently, still at her level, your dad told Miss Sterling that you're building a demonstration engine for the youth engineering competition. Can you tell me about your project? What are you trying to demonstrate? Emma looked at her father for permission, and Marcus nodded encouragement, watching as she straightened her shoulders and began explaining her design with the passionate clarity of someone who genuinely understood what she had created. It's a miniature internal combustion engine that shows how controlled explosions can be converted into rotational motion through precise timing and mechanical advantage. I designed it to demonstrate thermodynamic principles, specifically how heat energy in expanding gases can perform work when properly contained and directed through crankshaft mechanisms. David's eyebrows rose, genuine surprise crossing his face. You're 7 years old and you designed this yourself. My mom taught me engineering before she died, Emma said matter-of-factly, the way children spoke about fundamental truths they had long since integrated into their understanding of the world. She believed everyone should understand how things work, not just people who could afford fancy schools. So she taught me about forces and motion and energy conversion, and after she died I kept learning because it felt like keeping her alive somehow. This engine is based on principles she explained using household materials, but I wanted to build something that could actually function, not just demonstrate concepts theoretically. May I examine it? David asked, extending his hands carefully, and Emma passed over her engine with visible reluctance, the way people handed over precious things to strangers who might not understand their value. David held the small mechanism with respect that suggested he recognized the work it represented, turning it slowly in his hands while his trained eyes catalogued every component and connection. Emma, this is extraordinary work. The design is sound, the assembly is careful, and you've clearly thought through the mechanical relationships comprehensively. But I can see you've been working under difficult conditions. Some of your tolerances are slightly off, which will prevent optimal function, and a few components show stress from inadequate tools during installation. I know, Emma said quietly, and Marcus heard years of frustration compressed into those 2 words. I've been working in the storage room at the community center because they lost funding for their engineering lab. The lights flicker constantly, the tables aren't level, and all the precision tools are broken or missing. I did the best I could, but I knew it wouldn't be as good as projects built by kids who have access to proper facilities. David looked at Marcus over Emma's head, and something unspoken passed between them, some recognition between people who understood what it meant to work under impossible conditions and produce results despite limitations. Emma, here's what I'd like to propose. You've got about 4 hours before your competition starts. I'd like to help you rebuild the critical components of your engine using our equipment here, with you doing all the work and me just providing guidance and tool access. We can verify your measurements, ensure proper tolerances, and test your engine under controlled conditions so you know exactly how it will perform when you present to the judges. Would that be all right with you? Emma's face lit up with such pure joy that Marcus felt his heart clench, seeing his daughter finally receiving what she should have had access to all along, what every child interested in engineering should have available as basic educational infrastructure rather than extraordinary privilege. Really? I can use all this equipment? The precision measuring tools and the testing station and everything. Everything you need, David confirmed. This is your project, Emma. You designed it, you built it, and you understand it better than anyone else could. I'm just here to make sure you have the resources to execute your vision properly. Now, let's start by getting accurate measurements of your current components and identifying which ones need to be rebuilt. Can you explain your assembly sequence for me? Emma launched into detailed explanation, her hands moving expressively as she described how each component related to others, how timing mechanisms coordinated cylinder firing, how the crankshaft converted linear motion into rotation, and Marcus stood back watching his daughter bloom in the presence of genuine attention and adequate resources. David listened with focused intensity, asking clarifying questions that demonstrated real understanding, treating Emma like a colleague rather than a child, and Marcus recognized the particular gift of being taken seriously by someone whose expertise you respected. They worked together for the next 3 hours, Emma's small hands guided by David's expertise, using precision measuring tools to verify dimensions and identify components that needed adjustment, carefully disassembling and rebuilding sections of the engine with tolerances that would have been impossible in the community center storage room. David explained advanced concepts as they worked, talking about thermal expansion and friction coefficients and material properties, and Emma absorbed everything with the focused hunger of someone finally being given access to knowledge she had been seeking desperately. Marcus watched from a respectful distance, not wanting to interfere with the working relationship developing between his daughter and the senior engineer, but unable to completely suppress the professional interest that surfaced as he observed their techniques. Several times he found himself mentally cataloging their process, recognizing optimal sequences and efficient methods, feeling the old familiar pull of expertise that wanted to be exercised, of skills that felt incomplete when only observed rather than actively practiced. He had walked away from this kind of work 7 years ago, had convinced himself that grief had made him incapable of functioning at the level required, but standing here now watching Emma thrive in an environment that supported rather than hindered her abilities, Marcus wondered if maybe he had been wrong, if maybe he had allowed fear rather than wisdom to dictate his choices. At 12:30 p.m., with 90 minutes until the competition began, David and Emma completed the final testing sequence, running Emma's engine through multiple cycles while measuring performance against theoretical predictions. The engine performed flawlessly, converting heat energy into mechanical motion with efficiency that made Emma gasp with delight, and David documented the results with professional thoroughness before shutting down the test equipment and returning the engine to Emma's careful hands. "You built something remarkable, Emma," David said seriously, meeting her eyes with respect that didn't condescend to her age. "This engine demonstrates understanding of principles that engineering students don't encounter until college, and you executed your design with skill that would be impressive at any age. I hope you win your competition, but regardless of what the judges decide, you should be proud of what you've created here. You're genuinely talented, and I hope you continue pursuing engineering because the field needs people like you." Emma threw her arms around David in an impulsive hug that made the senior engineer's face soften with surprised affection, and Marcus saw David return the embrace carefully, the way adults hug children who weren't their own, with warmth that respected boundaries. When Emma pulled back, her eyes were bright with tears of gratitude that she blinked away quickly, and her voice carried steady determination when she spoke. "Thank you for helping me. I know my project is better because of what we did here today, but that's not why I'm grateful. I'm grateful because you treated me like I mattered, like my ideas were worth your time and attention, like being 7 years old didn't mean I couldn't understand complex concepts. My mom used to make me feel that way, and after she died, I mostly just felt like people thought I was cute for being interested in engineering rather than taking me seriously. You took me seriously. That matters more than the tools or the testing equipment or any of the technical help." Marcus had to turn away for a moment, had to press his hand against his eyes and breathe slowly to prevent the tears from coming, because his daughter had just articulated something he hadn't known she felt, had revealed loneliness and the need for validation that he thought he had been providing but apparently hadn't managed in the way she needed. He felt the familiar weight of inadequacy that came from trying to be both parents, from recognizing that despite his best efforts, there were things Emma needed that he couldn't provide alone, knowledge and perspective and connection that required more than just one person's love and attention. Victoria Sterling's voice came from behind him, quiet and unexpected. "David, may I speak with Mr. Hayes privately for a moment?" Marcus turned to find Victoria standing in the laboratory entrance, dressed more casually than he had ever seen her, without the severe suit and pulled-back hair that defined her corporate presence. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders, and her expression carried something Marcus couldn't quite identify, some combination of vulnerability and determination that transformed her from the Ice Queen who had humiliated him into someone more human and uncertain. David nodded and returned his attention to Emma, asking if she wanted to see the advanced modeling software they used for design work, and Emma followed him eagerly to the computer stations, giving Marcus and Victoria privacy by the laboratory entrance. They stood in uncomfortable silence for a moment before Victoria spoke, her voice lacking the commanding certainty that had characterized every previous interaction. "Mr. Hayes, I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what I said in the testing bay this morning. I made a cruel bet because I was terrified of failing publicly and I needed to feel in control. I turned your dignity into entertainment for my ego. I humiliated you in front of witnesses because showing dominance was easier than admitting I didn't have answers. And then you saved my company, and you refused recognition, and you asked only that your daughter have resources she deserved. You demonstrated strength and character that made me realize how hollow everything I've built actually is." Marcus listened quietly, watching Victoria struggle with vulnerability that clearly didn't come naturally, seeing the effort it required for her to articulate words that probably felt dangerous to someone who had built identity on never showing weakness. "You kept your word, Miss Sterling. You gave Emma access to facilities that will let her compete fairly. I'm grateful for that." "I had you investigated," Victoria said bluntly, and Marcus felt his stomach drop. "After you fixed the prototype, I needed to know who you really were, what your background was, how someone pushing a mop could perform repairs that baffled my engineering team. I found your military service record. Captain Hayes. I found your commendations, your achievements, your reputation as one of the best maintenance officers in your generation. I found documentation of you saving lives under fire, of technical expertise that made you invaluable to special operations. And I found that you walked away from all of it, sacrificed everything that society defines as valuable, so you could raise your daughter after your wife died." Marcus felt old defensive walls rising, the protective isolation he had built around his past threatening to become anger at having privacy violated. But when he looked at Victoria's face, he saw something there that diffused the anger before it could fully form, saw genuine remorse and the kind of shame that came from recognizing you had wronged someone who didn't deserve it. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know that I understand now what I did when I made that bet. I didn't just humiliate a janitor. I humiliated a decorated officer who gave up recognition and achievement to love his daughter completely. I mocked someone whose courage and sacrifice make everything I've accomplished look small and selfish by comparison. And I want you to know that I understand that I'm ashamed of it, and that I'm trying to learn from it." "What do you want from me, Miss Sterling?" Marcus asked, hearing the exhaustion in his own voice. "An absolution? Permission to feel better about yourself? Some validation that you're actually a good person despite making cruel choices?" "I want to help," Victoria said simply. "Not just today, not just with Emma's competition, but ongoing. I want to fund a proper engineering program at the community center. I want to establish scholarships for kids like Emma who have talent but lack resources. I want to create opportunities for parents like you who sacrifice careers for family and deserve pathways back to meaningful work if they choose. I want to take the shame I feel about how I treated you and convert it into something that actually helps people rather than just making me feel better about my mistakes." Marcus studied her face, looking for signs of performance or manipulation, searching for evidence that this was just another corporate gesture designed to manage reputation rather than genuine commitment. But what he saw was someone struggling with realizations that clearly weren't comfortable, someone trying to articulate values they were just beginning to understand, someone at the very beginning of learning that strength sometimes meant admitting you were wrong and trying to be different. "That's good, Miss Sterling," he said carefully. "Those programs would help a lot of families. I hope you follow through." "I will. But Marcus, may I call you Marcus? I also want to offer you something personally. Not double your salary, not a promotion, but a choice. If you want to continue as custodial staff, that's completely valid and I respect it. But if you ever want to return to professional engineering work, Sterling Automotive would be honored to have someone with your expertise on our team. Senior position, significant salary, your own development projects, whatever would feel right for your skills and situation. No pressure, no timeline, just an open offer whenever you're ready." Marcus felt something twist in his chest, some complicated mixture of temptation and fear, because the offer touched desires he had spent 7 years suppressing, touched the part of him that still missed working on complex systems and solving sophisticated problems and using expertise that felt wasted pushing mops across marble floors. But it also touched the wound that never fully healed, the fear that grief had broken something fundamental in him, that he couldn't be trusted with work where mistakes had consequences, that choosing to return to professional engineering would somehow dishonor the choice he made to prioritize Emma. "I'll think about it," he said finally, which was as much honesty as he could offer. "Right now, I need to get Emma to her competition. But Miss Sterling, thank you. For the apology, for the offers, for treating my daughter like she mattered. That's more than I expected after last night." Victoria nodded, and Marcus thought he saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes before she blinked them away with the practiced control of someone still learning that showing emotion wasn't the same as showing weakness. "Marcus, one more thing. I visited my father today for the first time in months, really visited rather than just performing obligation. And I realized he taught me the same thing you're teaching Emma, that love sometimes means showing up even when it's hard, that being present matters more than being perfect, that connection requires vulnerability. You're a better parent than mine was, and Emma is lucky to have you. I hope you know that." Marcus watched Victoria walk away, her casual clothes and loose hair making her look younger and less armored than he had ever seen her, and he felt the strange sensation of witnessing someone at a crossroads, someone deciding whether to continue being who they had been or risk becoming someone different. He returned to where Emma stood with David, examining 3D models on the computer screen with rapt attention, and he felt gratitude and hope mixing together in his chest, gratitude that his daughter had been given this chance and hope that maybe the sacrifices he had made would lead to opportunities she deserved. "Ready to go show the judges what you're capable of?" Marcus asked, resting his hand on Emma's shoulder, and she turned to look up at him with such absolute trust and love that he felt blessed despite everything they had lost, despite all the struggles and limitations and moments when he had doubted whether he was enough. "I'm ready, Dad. Let's go win this thing." The youth engineering competition took place in the auditorium at the City Engineering Academy, a space that Emma had only seen in photographs on the website where she had spent hours studying images of students working in proper facilities with adequate resources and teachers who had built careers at major companies. Marcus walked beside his daughter through corridors lined with displays showcasing previous year's winning projects, each one demonstrating the kind of sophisticated execution that came from having access to equipment and guidance and time that wasn't constrained by inadequate community center hours. Emma clutched her engine carefully, the mechanism now performing at levels she hadn't believed possible when she was working in the storage room with flickering lights and broken tools, and Marcus could see confidence building in her posture as she observed the other young participants setting up their projects. There were perhaps 40 children total, ranging in age from 6 to 12, each presenting work that reflected their understanding and resources and the particular passion that had drawn them to engineering despite their youth. The judges were a panel of 5 professionals from various engineering disciplines, including a woman who had worked for NASA on orbital mechanics and a man who had designed hybrid propulsion systems for automotive manufacturers, and they moved through the presentations with careful attention, asking questions that probed understanding rather than just execution, clearly interested in how children thought about problems rather than just what they had managed to build. Marcus watched them work and felt some of his anxiety ease, recognizing that at least the evaluation would be fair, that Emma's brilliance would be judged on its own merits rather than just compared superficially to projects with more polish. Emma's turn came midway through the afternoon, her name called by the coordinator, and Marcus gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze of encouragement before she walked to the presentation area with her engine held carefully in both hands. He watched from the audience seating as she set up her display, as she arranged the engine and her hand-drawn schematics and the test data David had helped her document, and he felt his heart swell with pride at the professional competence she demonstrated despite being only 7 years old. "My name is Emma Hayes," she began, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet auditorium, "and my project demonstrates principles of internal combustion and thermodynamic energy conversion. I designed this miniature engine to show how controlled explosions in cylinders can be converted into rotational motion through precise timing and crankshaft mechanics, and I want to explain both the theory behind the design and the practical challenges I encountered during construction." The judges leaned forward with interest, one of them making notes while another studied Emma's schematics with professional attention. "Tell us about your design process, Emma. How did you decide on this particular configuration?" Emma launched into explanation that drew on concepts she had learned from her mother years ago, supplemented by research she had conducted independently and refined through the morning's work with David at Sterling Automotive's laboratory. She discussed compression ratios and ignition timing, described how she had calculated cylinder dimensions to optimize efficiency while remaining feasible at miniature scale, explained the trade-offs between different materials and the constraints imposed by tools available to her during construction. The judges asked increasingly sophisticated questions, clearly testing the depth of her understanding, and Emma answered each one with confidence that suggested genuine comprehension rather than memorization. When one judge asked about challenges encountered during the build, Emma didn't attempt to obscure the difficulties she had faced or present a falsely smooth narrative. I worked on this project primarily in a storage room at a community center that lost its engineering lab funding. The lighting was inadequate, the work tables weren't level, and most of the precision tools were broken or missing. I knew those conditions would affect the quality of my execution, but I didn't have access to better facilities until this morning when someone helped me. So I had to design with those limitations in mind, had to build in ways that would be forgiving of minor tolerance errors, had to test and adjust repeatedly because I couldn't verify measurements accurately with the equipment available. And this morning, the NASA engineer asked, "Someone helped you?" "Yes, ma'am. After I finished the initial build, my dad kept a promise he made to me. He found someone who let me use a real engineering laboratory for a few hours, with proper lighting and precision measuring tools and testing equipment. A senior engineer named David helped me verify my measurements and rebuild components to correct tolerances. The theory and design are entirely mine, but the final execution quality reflects having temporary access to resources I've been working without." The judges exchanged glances, something unspoken passing between them, and Marcus felt his stomach tighten with worry that Emma's honesty about receiving help might be interpreted as disqualifying or somehow less impressive than children who had built everything themselves. But when the lead judge spoke, his voice carried warmth rather than disapproval. "Emma, your honesty about your working conditions and the assistance you received demonstrates integrity that's unfortunately rare even among adult engineers. Many people in your situation would have tried to hide the fact that they lacked adequate resources or received help, would have tried to present their work as if it emerged from ideal conditions. The fact that you're transparent about both your limitations and your adaptations shows maturity beyond your years. Can you run your engine for us now?" Emma's face transformed with delight, and she activated her engine with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly how the mechanism functioned and what to observe during operation. The miniature cylinders fired in sequence, converted heat energy into mechanical motion with visible efficiency, and the crankshaft rotated smoothly while Emma provided real-time commentary on what was happening and why each component mattered. The judges watched with clear appreciation, making notes and conferring quietly among themselves, and when the demonstration concluded, they thanked Emma formally before she collected her materials and returned to sit beside Marcus in the audience. "You were brilliant," Marcus whispered, pulling her close and feeling her lean against him with the particular exhaustion that came from performing under pressure and executing successfully. "Your mom would have been so proud of you." "She would have been proud of you too, Dad," Emma whispered back. "You kept your promise. You made sure I had what I needed. Whatever happens with the judging, I got to show them what I'm actually capable of when I have fair access to resources. That's all I wanted." They sat together watching the remaining presentations, Marcus's arm around Emma's shoulders while she gradually relaxed from performance tension into the comfortable fatigue of work completed. The other projects were impressive in various ways, demonstrating creativity and understanding and the particular enthusiasm that young people brought to engineering before it became routine professional work. Marcus found himself genuinely interested in several of them, found the part of his mind that loved problem-solving and elegant solutions engaging with concepts that other children had developed, and he felt something shift slightly in his understanding of himself, some recognition that maybe he hadn't entirely walked away from his professional identity, had just been keeping it dormant rather than destroyed. The judging deliberation took perhaps 20 minutes, the 5 professionals conferring at the front of the auditorium while participants and families waited with varying degrees of patience and anxiety. Marcus watched Emma try to maintain calm while her foot bounced nervously against the chair in front of them, watched her hands twist together in her lap, watched hope and doubt alternate across her face in rapid succession. He wanted to tell her that regardless of the outcome she had already won something more important than any scholarship, had already demonstrated brilliance and resilience and the ability to produce remarkable work despite obstacles. But he knew the scholarship mattered, knew that access to the advanced summer program would provide resources and instruction that could transform her trajectory, so he stayed quiet and simply held her hand while they waited. When the lead judge finally stood to announce results, Marcus felt Emma's grip on his hand tighten to painful pressure, and he squeezed back with reassurance he hoped would translate through skin and bone into her anxious heart. The judge spoke about the overall quality of submissions, praised the creativity and dedication visible across all age groups, acknowledged the particular challenges that young engineers faced when pursuing their interests without adult levels of resources and experience. "We had several exceptionally strong projects this year," the judge continued, "but one stood out not just for technical execution but for the combination of sophisticated understanding, honest assessment of working conditions, and resourceful adaptation to limitations. The recipient of this year's primary scholarship to the Advanced Summer Program, demonstrating principles of thermodynamic efficiency and internal combustion mechanics at a level that exceeded our expectations, is Emma Hayes. Marcus felt Emma go rigid beside him for a heartbeat before she erupted into motion, launching herself at him with a squeal of pure joy that he suspected echoed through the auditorium but he couldn't actually hear over the roaring in his own ears. He caught her automatically, lifting her off the ground and spinning in a circle while she laughed and cried simultaneously, and Marcus felt his own tears finally breaking free after years of holding them back, felt grief and pride and overwhelming love mixing together until he couldn't distinguish separate emotions, just an overwhelming sense that maybe finally something was going right. Maybe finally the sacrifices were translating into opportunities, maybe finally Emma was getting the recognition her brilliance deserved. He set her down gently and she ran to the front to accept her certificate and scholarship documentation from the judges, her face glowing with happiness that made her look so much like Sarah in that moment that Marcus had to press his hand against his chest to contain the physical ache. The NASA engineer knelt to Emma's level and said something that made Emma nod seriously, and then Emma was returning with her certificate clutched carefully and her eyes bright with tears of joy she didn't bother hiding. "They said I get to spend 6 weeks this summer learning from professional engineers," Emma said breathlessly, the words tumbling out faster than she could organize them. "They said I'll have access to laboratories and modeling software and mentorship from people who worked for major companies. They said they're excited to see what I'll learn when I have proper resources. Dad, this is everything I wanted. This is what Mom would have wanted for me. She would be so proud of you, Emma. She is proud of you, wherever she is. And I'm proud of you too, sweetheart. You earned this." They stayed for the remainder of the ceremony, watching other awards presented and listening to the closing remarks about the importance of supporting young people's interests in STEM fields, and Marcus found himself thinking about Victoria's offer to fund programs at the community center, thinking about how many other talented children were probably working under conditions similar to what Emma had endured, thinking about how access to basic resources shouldn't require exceptional circumstances or random encounters with guilt-motivated CEOs. As they walked to the parking lot afterward, Emma chattering excitedly about the summer program and what she wanted to learn and questions she wanted to ask the professional mentors, Marcus noticed a figure leaning against his old car waiting for them. Victoria Sterling stood in casual clothes with her arms crossed and a hesitant smile on her face, and Marcus felt surprise and wariness mixed together as they approached. "I hope you don't mind," Victoria said quickly, holding up her hands in a gesture of no threat intended. "David called and told me Emma had won. I wanted to congratulate her personally. Emma, you're extraordinary. Congratulations on your scholarship." Emma looked up at her father for guidance, and Marcus nodded permission before Emma turned back to Victoria with careful politeness. "Thank you, Miss Sterling. And thank you for letting me use your laboratory this morning. Mr. David said I did all the work myself, but I know I couldn't have made my engine work properly without access to those tools and his help checking my measurements. That made a big difference." Victoria knelt down to Emma's eye level, the gesture becoming familiar now, and Marcus recognized that she was learning to interact with children in ways that suggested genuine interest rather than adult condescension. "Emma, having access to proper tools absolutely made a difference in your execution quality. But the tools didn't design your engine, didn't understand the thermodynamic principles, didn't figure out how to adapt to difficult working conditions. That was all you. The judges recognized your brilliance, not just your execution. And I hope you'll let me continue helping you access resources as you pursue engineering. Your talent deserves support. Are you my dad's girlfriend?" Emma asked with the characteristic directness of 7-year-olds who hadn't yet learned that some questions were considered inappropriate, and Marcus felt his face heat while Victoria's eyes widened with surprise. "Emma," Marcus started to redirect, but Victoria held up a hand with a slight smile that transformed her normally severe features into something warmer and more approachable. "I'm your dad's employer, Emma. Though I hope I might become his friend, if he's willing to forgive some mistakes I made. I treated your father badly, and he responded by being kinder than I deserved, and I'm trying to learn from that example. Does that answer your question?" Emma studied Victoria with the assessing gaze of a child trying to determine if an adult was being honest or just telling her what they thought she wanted to hear. "You seem sad," she observed finally. "Like there's something missing that you want but don't know how to get. My dad looks like that sometimes too, when he thinks I'm not watching. Are grown-ups always sad about things they lost?" Victoria's composure cracked slightly, tears visibly threatening before she blinked them away, and Marcus saw in that moment just how much his daughter's observation had struck true. "Some grown-ups are sad about things they lost, Emma. And some are sad about things they never had in the first place, things they didn't know they needed until they saw someone else who had them. Your dad isn't sad about being your father though. I can tell he loves you more than anything else in the world. I know, Emma said with the absolute certainty of a child who had never doubted being loved. He gave up everything important to take care of me after Mom died. He used to be a captain in the Air Force and fix airplanes and save people's lives, but he walked away from all that to be my dad. So even though he's sad about missing Mom, I know he doesn't regret choosing me. Marcus felt his throat close completely, felt tears threatening again, and he had to look away while he composed himself because his 7-year-old daughter had just articulated understanding he hadn't realized she possessed, had revealed that she saw and understood his sacrifices and found security rather than guilt in them. Victoria stood slowly, her own expression showing complicated emotions Marcus couldn't fully read, and she looked at him with something that might have been respect or might have been envy or might have been the beginning of the kind of connection that developed between people who recognized themselves in each other's struggles. Marcus, Victoria said quietly, I meant what I said earlier about the job offer, but I want to add something to it. I'd like to propose a partnership. Sterling Automotive will fund a comprehensive engineering education program at the community center where Emma has been working, proper facilities and equipment and instructor salaries. But I'd like you to help design and oversee it, bringing your expertise and understanding of what young people like Emma need to develop their abilities. Paid position, significant autonomy, meaningful work that uses your skills to help families facing situations similar to yours. No pressure to decide immediately, but I hope you'll consider it. Marcus felt the offer land like weight and possibility combined, felt temptation and fear warring in his chest because accepting would mean acknowledging that he was ready to return to professional work, would mean admitting that maybe he had been hiding in the custodial position longer than grief required, would mean risk and visibility and the chance of failure after years of being invisible and safe. But he looked at Emma's face, saw her hope and pride mingling together, and he understood that children learned what was possible by watching what their parents chose. I'll think about it seriously, he said, which was more commitment than he had offered before. And Victoria, thank you. For keeping your word about Emma, for the apology this morning, for trying to turn your mistakes into something constructive. That takes courage. Victoria nodded, and Marcus thought he saw relief in her expression, as if his willingness to consider her offer represented some form of absolution or at least the possibility of redemption through changed behavior. She said goodbye to Emma with genuine warmth, touched Marcus's shoulder briefly in a gesture that felt like tentative connection, and then walked to her own car parked several spaces away, expensive and pristine in contrast to Marcus's old vehicle that he kept running through constant maintenance and stubborn determination. I like her, Emma announced as they climbed into Marcus's car and he started the engine that coughed twice before catching. She's sad and she's trying to be better, and that's brave. And Dad, I think you should take the job she offered. Not because we need money, though money would be nice, but because you miss doing important work and you deserve to use your skills for things that matter. You've been taking care of me for 7 years. Maybe it's time to also take care of yourself. Marcus looked at his daughter in the rearview mirror, saw wisdom in her young face that shouldn't have been possible at 7 years old but somehow was, and he felt the familiar ache of missing Sarah mixed with gratitude that somehow despite everything, they had raised a child capable of profound empathy and understanding. When did you get so wise, Emma Hayes? Mom taught me to think about other people's feelings, and you taught me that love means wanting good things for people even when it's hard. So I'm thinking about your feelings, and I'm wanting good things for you even though it would be easier to keep everything the same. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, sweetheart. Perfect sense. Marcus pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward home, toward their small apartment and their modest life and the evening routine that had sustained them through 7 years of grief and adaptation and slowly building something new from the ruins of what they had lost. But something felt different now, some possibility opening that hadn't existed before, some sense that maybe the chapter of hiding was ending and a new chapter of cautious emergence might be beginning. They stopped for ice cream to celebrate Emma's scholarship victory, sitting together at a small table in the shop while Emma detailed everything she wanted to learn during the summer program and Marcus listened with attention that suggested her dreams mattered more than anything else in his world. Other families moved around them, living their lives and pursuing their own paths, and Marcus found himself noticing them differently than usual, seeing not just isolated individuals but networks of connection and care and the complicated ways that people tried to love each other despite everything that made loving difficult and dangerous. His phone buzzed with a message from Victoria. The program funding is approved regardless of your decision about the position. Emma and children like her will have proper resources starting immediately. But I hope you'll consider the partnership. Your expertise and heart would make it something special rather than just another corporate initiative. Marcus read the message twice, feeling the sincerity beneath the words, recognizing that Victoria was genuinely trying to change rather than just perform change for reputation management. He thought about Emma's observation that Victoria seemed sad about things she never had, thought about his own sadness about things he had lost, thought about how maybe healing required more than just enduring, required actually building new purposes and connections and meanings rather than just surviving on the foundation of what used to be. Dad, Emma said, pulling his attention back to the present, if you take that job helping with the engineering program, you could teach other kids like me. You could make sure they have what they need to learn and grow and discover what they are capable of. That would be like keeping Mom's work alive too, because she believed everyone should have access to knowledge and opportunity. You'd be doing what she would have done if she were still here. Marcus felt tears threatening yet again, felt the constant emotion of this impossibly long day finally overwhelming his ability to maintain composure, and he reached across the table to take Emma's small hand in his larger one, feeling her squeeze back with strength that seemed impossible for someone so young. I love you, Emma. More than I have words to explain. And you're right about everything. I think it's time for me to stop hiding in work that keeps me invisible and start using my skills to make a difference again. Not because I was wrong to prioritize you these past 7 years, but because you're right that I can do both now. I can be your father and also be someone who contributes meaningful work to the world. I'm proud of you, Dad, Emma said seriously, and hearing those words from his 7-year-old daughter broke something open in Marcus's chest that had been locked tight since Sarah died, some recognition that maybe he didn't have to carry all the grief and responsibility alone anymore, that maybe accepting help and partnership and the possibility of connection wasn't weakness but rather the next necessary step in healing. They finished their ice cream and drove home as the sun set over the city, painting the sky in colors that Sarah had always loved, and Marcus felt her presence in a way he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, not as absence but as continued influence, not as haunting but as blessing. Emma fell asleep in the back seat before they reached the apartment, exhausted from competition stress and victory joy, and Marcus carried her inside carefully, tucked her into bed still wearing her competition clothes, and stood in her doorway watching her sleep with her scholarship certificate visible on her desk beside the engine that had proven her brilliance. Later, alone in his own room with the night quiet around him, Marcus pulled out the hidden box from the back of his closet, the one containing his military uniforms and commendations and photographs of the person he used to be. He looked at the pictures not with the usual pain of loss but with something closer to recognition, seeing not someone who had failed or given up but someone who had loved deeply enough to transform completely, who had demonstrated strength through sacrifice, who had chosen presence over achievement and found purpose that mattered more than recognition. He composed a message to Victoria before he could second-guess himself. I'll take the partnership position. Let's build something that gives children like Emma the resources and support they deserve, regardless of their family's economic circumstances. And Victoria, thank you for giving me a reason to use my skills for something meaningful again. That matters more than you probably realized. The response came within minutes. Thank you for taking the chance. We'll make it something Sarah would be proud of, and something Emma can see as her father using his gifts to help others. I'm grateful for the opportunity to work with you and to learn from your example. See you Monday to discuss details. Marcus set down his phone and returned to the box of photographs, selecting one that showed him and Sarah on their wedding day, young and happy and completely unaware of how brief their time together would be. He placed the photograph on his nightstand rather than returning it to the hidden box, making it visible rather than tucked away, and he spoke quietly to the image in the empty room. I'm going to try something new, Sarah. I'm going to try being more than just Emma's father, though that will always be the most important part of who I am. I'm going to try using the skills you were so proud of to help families like ours, to make sure other children don't have to work in impossible conditions because funding decisions value some communities over others. And I'm going to try letting people in again, not because you're being replaced but because you taught me that love multiplies rather than divides, that opening yourself to connection honors rather than diminishes the love that came before. I think you'd be proud of Emma today. I know I am. And I hope you'd be proud of me for finally choosing to emerge from hiding. I love you. I miss you. And I'm going to keep living in ways that honor what you believed and what we built together. The photograph didn't answer because photographs never did, but Marcus felt something settle in his chest anyway, some peace that came from finally articulating intention rather than just enduring circumstances, from actively choosing forward movement rather than remaining frozen in the moment of loss. He lay down in his bed and closed his eyes, and for the first time in 7 years, he fell asleep not thinking about what had ended but what might be beginning, not mourning what was gone but anticipating what could be built, not defined by absence but by possibility and connection and the strange grace of second chances offered by people who recognized worth in unexpected places. 6 months passed in a cascade of changes that transformed Marcus's life from survival mode into something that felt increasingly like genuine living, like movement toward purpose rather than just maintenance of basic existence, and he found himself surprised repeatedly by how much had been waiting just beyond the walls he had built to protect himself from further loss. The partnership with Victoria Sterling to establish the Youth Engineering Education Program had become the central focus of his professional life, meaningful work that used his expertise while connecting him to families facing challenges he understood intimately, and Marcus discovered that teaching young people felt like honoring Sarah's memory in ways that pushing mops had never approached. The Community Center program opened its new facilities in November, a completely renovated space with proper lighting that didn't flicker, with level work tables and organized tool storage and precision equipment that children could use under supervision without worrying about broken components or inadequate resources. Marcus had overseen the design personally, thinking constantly about Emma's experience working in the converted storage room, ensuring that every detail supported learning rather than creating obstacles. They had hired 3 instructors with engineering backgrounds who understood how to teach children without condescension, and enrollment had filled immediately with a waiting list that stretched months into the future. Victoria attended the opening ceremony and gave remarks about corporate responsibility and community investment, but Marcus saw in her face and posture something that went beyond performance, genuine satisfaction that suggested she was finding meaning in the work beyond just managing reputation. She had continued coming to the community center occasionally after the opening, not with press or fanfare but quietly, watching children work on projects and sometimes offering encouragement or asking questions that demonstrated real interest. Marcus had observed the transformation in her over the months, watched Amma gradually softening into something more human, watched someone learning to value connection over control, and he found himself drawn to her in ways that felt both promising and terrifying. Emma had completed her first session of the advanced summer program at the Engineering Academy and returned with expanded knowledge and heightened ambition, already planning her next competition project and filling notebooks with increasingly sophisticated designs. She talked constantly about her mentors and the other students and the equipment she had access to, and Marcus saw in her face the particular joy of someone discovering they belonged in spaces they had previously only imagined from outside. The scholarship had opened doors that would shape her entire trajectory, and Marcus felt gratitude mixed with vindication, confirmation that fighting for his daughter's opportunities had been worth every moment of humiliation and struggle. His relationship with Victoria had developed slowly from professional partnership into something that neither of them could quite name but both recognized as significant. Afternoons spent reviewing program proposals turning into evenings discussing lives and losses and the particular difficulty of learning to be different after years of being defined by defense mechanisms. They had shared dinners, had taken Emma to museums and performances, had built the kind of gradual connection that came from sustained presence rather than sudden romance, and Marcus found himself thinking about Victoria at unexpected moments, wondering if maybe healing meant allowing someone new in rather than just protecting the space Sarah used to occupy. Emma had noticed, of course, had commented with characteristic directness about the way Marcus and Victoria looked at each other when they thought no one was watching, had asked pointed questions about whether Victoria might become part of their family in ways that extended beyond professional relationship. Marcus had been honest with his daughter about his uncertainty, about the guilt that came with considering loving someone new, about the fear that allowing Victoria to matter might somehow dishonor Sarah's memory or suggest that Emma's mother was replaceable. Emma had listened with the serious attention she gave to complex problems, and then she had said something that Marcus thought about constantly afterward. "Dad, Mom would want you to be happy. She would want you to have someone who loves you the way you loved her. And Victoria is sad about things she never had, and you're sad about things you lost, and maybe you could help each other be less sad while still remembering what made you sad in the first place. That's not replacing Mom. That's just choosing to keep living." Now, on a Friday evening in late autumn with the city lights beginning to sparkle and the air carrying the first genuine cold of approaching winter, Marcus stood in Sterling Automotive's executive offices waiting for Victoria to finish a late meeting, and he felt nervous anticipation building in his chest that reminded him of being much younger, of the early days with Sarah when everything felt new and possible and terrifying in equal measure. He had made a decision during the past few weeks, had chosen forward movement over protective stasis, and tonight he was going to articulate that choice regardless of outcome. Victoria emerged from the conference room looking exhausted but pleased, and her face transformed when she saw him waiting, that particular smile she seemed to reserve for moments when she forgot to maintain corporate presence and allowed genuine affection to surface. "Marcus, I didn't know you were stopping by tonight. Is everything all right with the program?" "Everything's fine with the program. I'm here about something else. Marcus gestured to her office, and Victoria nodded, leading him through doors into the space he had only been in a few times, all glass and steel and expensive furniture that still looked sterile despite obvious attempts to make it more personal with photographs from the community center and children's artwork Emma had given her. They sat in chairs facing each other rather than across her desk, and Marcus took a breath before speaking, organizing thoughts he had been rehearsing for days. Victoria, I need to tell you something that I've been trying to figure out how to say for months now. You and I both know that what we've been building together goes beyond professional partnership. The dinners and the time with Emma and the conversations about lives and losses, that's not just colleagues being friendly. And I think you feel what I feel, that there's something developing between us that neither of us knows exactly how to handle. Victoria's expression showed vulnerability and hope mixed together, and she nodded slowly without breaking eye contact. I do feel it. And I've been terrified to acknowledge it directly because I'm not sure I know how to be in a relationship with someone I respect and value without turning it into competition or control. I've spent my entire adult life believing that needing anyone was weakness, and what I feel for you requires admitting I need your presence, your perspective, your partnership in ways that go beyond what we're building for children. 7 years ago I walked away from professional work because I couldn't imagine functioning after Sarah died. I convinced myself that grief had broken something fundamental in me, that I couldn't be trusted with responsibilities beyond taking care of Emma. But working with you these past months has shown me that I was wrong. I wasn't broken, I was just choosing to prioritize differently. And now Emma is older, is thriving in ways that don't require my constant presence, and I find myself wanting things I thought I had given up permanently. I want meaningful work, which I have now. And I want companionship with someone who understands that loving again doesn't erase what came before. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped together tightly. Marcus, I need you to understand something about me before we go further with this conversation. I don't know how to be vulnerable with people. I don't know how to need someone without it feeling like surrender. My father taught me that control was survival, and I've built my entire identity on those principles. What we're talking about would require me to let go of control, to trust that you won't use my feelings against me, to accept that sometimes being strong means admitting you can't do everything alone. I want to be capable of that, but I honestly don't know if I am. I'm terrified too, Marcus said quietly. Sarah was the first person I ever loved completely, and losing her nearly destroyed me. The idea of loving someone new means accepting that loss is always possible, that opening yourself to connection means accepting vulnerability to pain. But Emma reminded me recently that my mom would want me to be happy, would want me to keep living fully rather than just surviving safely. And Victoria, you make me want to try. You make me want to risk caring again because what we're building together feels worth the danger. Victoria stood and moved to the window, looking out over the city lights with her back to Marcus, and he watched her shoulders rise and fall with deep breaths that suggested she was trying to maintain composure while processing emotions she didn't usually allow herself to feel. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the particular strain of someone working through realizations in real time. 6 months ago I was standing at this same window thinking about how empty everything felt, how all the success and achievement and recognition meant nothing because I had no one to share it with, no connection that mattered more than quarterly earnings reports. And then you fixed my prototype and refused recognition and asked only for your daughter to have resources, and something fundamental shifted in how I understood strength and purpose and what actually matters. You've been teaching me through example that love isn't weakness, that vulnerability isn't failure, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you need help and accept it when offered. She turned back to face him, and Marcus saw tears streaming down her face that she made no attempt to hide or wipe away, saw someone finally allowing herself to feel without performing control. I'm falling in love with you, Marcus. I think I've been falling since that morning in the testing bay when you demonstrated more courage and character than I've shown in my entire life. And it terrifies me because I don't know how to be in love without becoming someone different than I've spent 33 years becoming. But I want to try. I want to learn how to be the kind of person who can love fully and be loved in return. Marcus stood and crossed to where Victoria was standing, and he did what felt natural despite all his fear and uncertainty. He pulled her into an embrace that she returned with desperate intensity, her tears soaking into his shirt while he held her with steady certainty. They stood together in silence for a long moment, just breathing and being present, and Marcus felt something settle that had been unsettled since Sarah died, not erasure of what he had lost but permission to continue building despite loss, to honor memory through continued living rather than permanent mourning. We'll figure it out together, Marcus said quietly into her hair. Neither of us knows how to do this, but maybe that's okay. Maybe love is always figuring it out together, always choosing each other despite uncertainty, always trusting that whatever comes next will be worth the risk of trying. Victoria pulled back slightly and looked up at him, and Marcus saw in her face the particular beauty of someone being genuinely seen and choosing not to hide. "I'd like to try something," she said. "I'd like the first time we kiss to be because we love each other, not because of any fixed machine or fulfilled bet or obligation. I'd like it to be because we're choosing each other consciously and hopefully." Marcus felt his breath catch because the statement was simultaneously vulnerable and certain. Was Victoria taking initiative while acknowledging emotion? Was exactly the kind of synthesis of strength and openness that he had been hoping she could achieve. He cupped her face gently in his hands, feeling her lean into the touch, and he spoke words he hadn't said to anyone since Sarah died. "I love you, Victoria Sterling. Not because you're perfect or because you have everything figured out, but because you're trying to become someone different, because you treat my daughter with genuine care, because you've shown me that maybe it's possible to build something new without betraying what came before. And I'd very much like to kiss you now, if you're sure that's what you want." "I'm sure," Victoria whispered, and Marcus leaned in and pressed his lips to hers with gentleness that acknowledged this was both ending and beginning, was closure on one chapter and opening of another, was taking a chance on possibility after years of protecting against further loss. The kiss deepened naturally, both of them surrendering to connection they had been building toward for months, and Marcus felt alive in ways he had forgotten were possible, felt desire and hope and the particular joy of discovering that maybe happiness wasn't permanently finished just because it had been interrupted. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily and smiling with vulnerability that suggested they recognized the significance of what had just happened, Marcus heard familiar voice from the office doorway. "I knew it." They turned together to find Emma standing in the doorway wearing her backpack and grinning with such absolute delight that Marcus couldn't help laughing despite the awkward timing. "Emma, what are you doing here? I thought you were at Sophie's house for the sleepover." "Sophie's mom had to cancel because Sophie's brother got sick. She called you but you didn't answer because your phone is probably on silent, so she called Miss Sterling's office number that you gave for emergencies and the security guard brought me up here. And I'm so glad he did because I got to see you two finally kiss after months of looking at each other like you wanted to but were too scared to try." Victoria laughed, genuine and unguarded, and knelt down to Emma's level with easy familiarity that had developed over months of building relationship. "Were we really that obvious?" "So obvious. Everyone at the community center has been asking me when you two are going to start dating officially. Even David asked me last week if my dad had figured out he loves you yet. You're both terrible at hiding feelings." Marcus felt his face heat with embarrassment but also joy because his daughter's enthusiastic approval meant more than she probably understood, meant that she didn't feel threatened or replaced by Victoria's presence, meant that Emma was secure enough in his love to welcome rather than resent new connection. "Emma Hayes, you're entirely too perceptive for 7 years old." "Almost 8 now," Emma corrected. "And I'm glad you're together. Miss Sterling makes you smile in ways you haven't smiled since Mom died, and you make Miss Sterling less scared to be herself. Plus she's really nice to me and she cares about helping kids like me have better opportunities. So if you're asking my permission or whatever, yes, I think you should definitely date each other and probably get married eventually if things keep going well." Victoria's eyes widened at the marriage mention, and Marcus saw brief panic cross her face before she visibly worked through it and returned to calm. "Let's maybe not plan the wedding quite yet, Emma. Your dad and I just had our first kiss about 90 seconds ago. But I appreciate your enthusiasm and your approval. They both matter to me. Can we get dinner together?" Emma asked hopefully. "To celebrate you finally admitting you love each other? I promise not to be weird about it or make too many jokes about you kissing, though I definitely can't promise I won't make NY jokes because that would be lying and you taught me to always be honest." Marcus and Victoria exchanged glances, and Marcus saw in her expression something that made his heart expand, saw her choosing connection despite discomfort, saw her prioritizing Emma's needs and including her in this moment rather than treating her as interruption. "Dinner sounds perfect," Victoria said. "Where should we go?" They ended up at the same ice cream shop where Marcus and Emma had celebrated her scholarship victory 6 months earlier, and they sat together at a table near the window watching the city move around them while eating ice cream for dinner in defiance of all reasonable nutrition guidelines. Emma chatted happily about her latest project and her plans for the next engineering competition and questions she wanted to ask her summer program mentors, and Marcus and Victoria listened with the particular attention that came from genuinely caring about someone's dreams and wanting to support their pursuit. At one point Emma excused herself to use the restroom, leaving Marcus and Victoria briefly alone, and Victoria reached across the table to take his hand with tentative affection that suggested she was still learning how physical connection worked in romantic contexts. "Thank you for taking a chance on me," she said quietly. "I know I'm not easy, that I come with a lot of baggage and defense mechanisms and learned behaviors that aren't healthy. But I promise I'm going to keep trying to be someone worth loving, someone who can be a good partner to you and a positive presence in Emma's life." "You're already worth loving, Victoria. Not because you're perfect or because you've fixed everything about yourself, but because you're trying, because you're willing to be vulnerable, because you treat the people I love with genuine care. That's enough. You don't have to earn love through perfect performance. You just have to show up honestly and keep choosing connection even when it's scary." Emma returned and they finished their ice cream while the sun set and the shop filled with evening customers, families and couples and groups of friends all living their lives and pursuing their own paths toward happiness or meaning or whatever they were seeking. Marcus looked at his daughter and his new partner sitting together laughing about something Emma had said, and he felt Sarah's presence not as absence but as blessing, felt certainty that loving again didn't diminish what he had lost but rather honored it by demonstrating that love had taught him how to keep loving even after devastating loss. When they finally left the shop and walked to the parking lot, Emma between them holding both their hands and swinging their arms with characteristic enthusiasm, Victoria looked at Marcus over Emma's head and mouthed the words "thank you" with expression that suggested she understood the gift he was offering, the chance to be part of a family, the opportunity to learn love through practice rather than theory. Marcus squeezed her hand in response, promise and reassurance combined, and he felt hopeful about the future in ways he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 7 years. They stood together beside Marcus's old car, the three of them in a small circle in the autumn evening, and Emma looked up at both adults with serious expression that suggested she had something important to say. "I just want you both to know that I'm really happy right now. I miss Mom every single day and I always will, but I'm happy that Dad has someone who loves him and that Miss Sterling has us. Is that okay? To be happy even though Mom is gone?" Marcus knelt down and pulled Emma into a hug while Victoria knelt beside them and joined the embrace, all three of them holding each other in the parking lot while traffic passed and life continued around them. "It's absolutely okay to be happy, sweetheart," Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion. "Your mom would want all of us to be happy. She would want me to keep living fully and you to keep growing brilliantly and Victoria to discover what love feels like. Being happy doesn't mean forgetting. It means honoring memory by choosing joy when it's offered." They stood eventually and said goodbyes, making plans to meet for breakfast the next morning, and Marcus drove home with Emma while Victoria followed in her own car for a while before turning toward her penthouse. Emma fell asleep quickly after they reached the apartment, exhausted from the emotional intensity of the evening, and Marcus tucked her in while she murmured something about being happy for him in her sleep. Later, alone in his room, Marcus pulled out his phone and found a message from Victoria. "Thank you for tonight. Thank you for taking a chance on someone who doesn't know how to do this but wants to learn. Thank you for showing me that strength sometimes means admitting you need help and accepting it when offered. I love you. I'm terrified. But I'm choosing to try anyway. Marcus replied simply, "I love you too. We'll figure it out together. One day at a time, with honesty and patience and commitment to being present for each other. That's all any of us can do. Sleep well, and I'll see you tomorrow. He set down his phone and looked at the photograph of Sarah on his nightstand, the one he had moved from the hidden box 6 months earlier, and he spoke quietly to her image in the empty room. "I'm doing it, Sarah. I'm choosing to keep living fully rather than just surviving safely. I'm allowing myself to love again without erasing what we had. And Emma is thriving in ways that would make you so proud. I hope wherever you are, you're at peace knowing that we're going to be okay. That we already are okay, even though we still miss you. Thank you for teaching me how to love completely. That skill is serving me well now as I try to love someone new while honoring what we built together." The photograph didn't answer because it never did, but Marcus felt Sarah's blessing anyway, felt permission to continue building his life in ways that honored her memory through continued living rather than permanent mourning. He lay down and closed his eyes and fell asleep thinking about tomorrow's breakfast and next week's program planning meeting and the slow careful process of building relationship with someone who needed patience and consistency and the demonstrated certainty that love was possible even for people who had been taught that needing anyone was weakness. Outside his window the city continued its eternal rhythm, lights sparkling and traffic flowing and countless lives being lived in all their complexity and beauty and struggle, and Marcus Hayes slept peacefully for the first time in 7 years, no longer defined by what he had lost but by what he was building, by the daughter he loved and the partner he was learning to love and the work that gave him purpose and the strange grace of second chances that arrived in the most unexpected ways. 1 year after Marcus fixed the prototype vehicle that saved Sterling Automotive's military contract, Victoria Sterling stood at a podium in the grand ballroom of the city's premier hotel addressing an audience of 200 people gathered for the dedication ceremony of the Sarah Hayes Memorial Foundation for Engineering Education. The foundation represented 18 months of planning and partnership, Victoria's initial guilt transformed into comprehensive commitment, Marcus's expertise channeled into program design that would serve thousands of children across underserved communities, and both of them learning through practice what it meant to build something meaningful together. The ballroom was elegant but not ostentatious, decorated with photographs of young engineers working in the laboratories and workshops that the foundation had established, with children's drawings of mechanisms and structures displayed alongside quotes about curiosity and creativity and the importance of supporting exploration regardless of economic circumstances. Emma sat in the front row between Marcus and her grandparents, Sarah's parents who had traveled from across the country for the ceremony, and Victoria could see the mix of emotions visible on all their faces as they prepared to watch a foundation named for their beloved daughter and wife and mother be officially launched into the world. Victoria had spent weeks writing her remarks, had drafted and revised and consulted with Marcus about how to honor Sarah's memory without presuming to understand grief she had never personally experienced, and standing at the podium now with all those expectant faces turned toward her, she felt nervous vulnerability that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago when control had been her only goal and showing uncertainty had felt like unacceptable weakness. "Good evening, and thank you all for being here tonight," Victoria began, her voice carrying clearly through the excellent acoustics. "We're gathered to celebrate the official launch of the Sarah Hayes Memorial Foundation for Engineering Education, an initiative that represents everything I've learned over the past 18 months about what actually matters, about how success should be measured, and about the difference between achievement that serves ego and work that serves community." She paused, gathering herself for the vulnerability she had practiced but still found difficult. 2 years ago, I was standing in Sterling Automotive's headquarters at 3 a.m. facing a crisis that threatened to cost my company $200 million and significant reputation damage. I was terrified, which I had learned to disguise as dominance, and when a janitor on my overnight custodial staff stopped to observe the situation, I made a cruel bet that turned his dignity into entertainment. I offered to double his salary if he could fix what my engineering team could not, and I did so publicly, with witnesses recording, because demonstrating my power was more important to me than treating another human being with basic respect. The audience was silent, attention focused completely on Victoria as she spoke words that cost her something to articulate, and she saw Marcus watching from the front row with encouragement visible in his expression, with the steady presence that had become her anchor during months of learning to be different. That janitor was Captain Marcus Hayes, decorated Air Force maintenance officer who had walked away from an elite career to raise his daughter alone after his wife Sarah died in an accident that shattered his world. He accepted my cruel bet not because he needed recognition or wanted to prove anything, but because he had promised his 7-year-old daughter that she would have what she needed to compete fairly in a youth engineering competition, and keeping that promise mattered more than protecting his pride. He fixed my prototype vehicle, demonstrating expertise that saved my company, and then he refused the reward I offered. He asked only that his daughter Emma have access to proper resources for a few hours so she could complete her competition project under fair conditions. Victoria saw Emma lean against her father's shoulder, saw Marcus's arm go around his daughter with automatic affection, and she felt gratitude for the family that had chosen to include her despite everything. Marcus's refusal to accept recognition for himself, his insistence that only his daughter's needs mattered, was the moment I began to understand that everything my father taught me about strength and success and what mattered was fundamentally wrong. I had been measuring worth with the wrong instruments entirely. I had been defining achievement as accumulation of power and wealth and control, when actual achievement was measured in how you treated people, how you loved despite risk of loss, how you used your resources to create opportunities for others rather than just advancing your own position. She detailed the foundation's mission and scope, the comprehensive programs being established in community centers across the city, the partnerships with schools and professional engineering organizations, the scholarship opportunities and mentorship initiatives and equipment grants that would ensure children like Emma had access to resources regardless of economic circumstances. Victoria explained the operational budget and sustainability plans and metrics for success that went beyond simple enrollment numbers to focus on outcomes and participant experiences and long-term trajectory changes. But before we celebrate what this foundation will accomplish going forward, I want to honor the person whose memory inspired its creation. Sarah Hayes was an educator who believed that knowledge should be accessible to everyone, that understanding how things worked was a democratic right rather than an exclusive privilege, that teaching children to think critically and ask questions and pursue curiosity was one of the most important contributions any person could make to the world. She taught her daughter Emma these principles before Emma could read, and she created in her daughter a passion for engineering that survived her own death and became Emma's connection to her mother's legacy. Victoria's voice wavered slightly, emotion threatening to break through practiced composure, and she paused to breathe deeply before continuing. Sarah Hayes never had the chance to see her daughter win scholarships or enter advanced programs or demonstrate the extraordinary talent that Sarah had nurtured so carefully. She never got to see Marcus rebuild his professional identity while continuing to be an exceptional father. She never got to know that her loss would eventually transform into a foundation that will serve thousands of children and teach them that their dreams are valid and achievable regardless of circumstances. But I believe, and Marcus believes, and Emma believes, that Sarah would be proud of what we're building in her name, that she would recognize her values and her passion and her commitment to equity reflected in every program and initiative and scholarship this foundation will fund. The audience applauded, genuine and warm, and Victoria felt tears threatening but allowed them to come rather than fighting to maintain perfect control. She had learned over the past year that showing emotion wasn't weakness but rather honesty, that allowing people to see her struggle and uncertainty didn't diminish her authority but rather made her more credible, more trustworthy, more human. The Sarah Hayes Memorial Foundation officially opens its doors tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., when our first cohort of young engineers will arrive at the community center to begin working in facilities that match what they deserve rather than what budget limitations had previously allowed. They will have proper lighting and level tables and precision tools. They will have instructors who take them seriously and mentors who believe in their potential. They will have proof that society values their dreams enough to invest resources in supporting them. And every single child who benefits from this foundation will know Sarah Hayes' name and understand that they have opportunities because one woman believed that knowledge should be accessible to everyone and taught her daughter values that survived her death and inspired others to action. Victoria looked directly at Marcus and Emma as she spoke her final words, addressing them personally despite the 200 witnesses. Marcus, Emma, thank you for taking a chance on someone who didn't know how to be worthy of your trust. Thank you for teaching me what strength actually means, what love actually requires, what success actually looks like when measured against things that truly matter. This foundation exists because you demonstrated grace under impossible circumstances, because you responded to cruelty with dignity, because you showed me that people can change if they are willing to do the uncomfortable work of becoming different. I hope Sarah would approve of what we've built together. I hope she would recognize that her legacy lives on not just in her brilliant daughter but in the thousands of children who will benefit from programs inspired by her values and made possible by her family's generosity in sharing their story. She stepped back from the podium and returned to her seat beside Marcus, and he immediately took her hand and squeezed with warmth that communicated volumes without words. Emma leaned across her father to whisper shout, "That was perfect, Miss Victoria. Mom would have loved it." And Victoria felt something in her chest expand with affection for this remarkable child who had welcomed her into their family with such open generosity. The remainder of the ceremony featured remarks from the Foundation's board members, from community leaders who had partnered in the establishment of programs, from a representative of the Engineering Academy where Emma attended summer sessions, and from Sarah's parents who spoke briefly about their daughter's passion and their gratitude that her memory was being honored through work that aligned so perfectly with her values. Then Marcus was invited to the podium, and Victoria watched him walk to the front with the confidence of someone who had finally integrated all his identities, who was no longer hiding expertise or pretending to be less than he was, who had learned that being visible didn't mean being vulnerable to unbearable loss. "Good evening," Marcus began, his military bearing still evident in his posture despite years away from service. 2 years ago I was pushing a mop across Sterling Automotive's lobby floor at 3 in the morning, trying very hard to be invisible, trying to be someone who didn't matter enough to attract attention or expectations or the possibility of failing at something important. I had convinced myself that walking away from my Air Force career was necessary because grief had broken something fundamental in me, because I couldn't trust myself with responsibilities where mistakes had consequences. I was wrong about that. Grief hadn't broken me. It had just changed my priorities in ways that required temporary invisibility while I focused entirely on raising my daughter. He looked at Emma and smiled with such absolute love that Victoria felt her throat tighten with emotion. Emma is 8 years old now, brilliant and passionate and exactly what her mother hoped she would become. She wins competitions, she asks questions that challenge professional engineers, she designs projects that demonstrate understanding far beyond her years. And she does all of this while being kind and generous and secure in the knowledge that she is loved completely. That security, that certainty that she matters more than anything else in the world, is what I gave her by choosing to walk away from professional achievement. And I don't regret that choice for a single moment. Marcus detailed his journey from that night in the testing bay through the development of the foundation partnership with Victoria, through the slow process of rebuilding professional identity while maintaining priority focus on Emma, through the unexpected gift of falling in love again and discovering that new connection didn't diminish what he had lost but rather honored it. He spoke about Sarah with warmth rather than pain, remembering her passion and her teaching and her belief that education could transform lives, and Victoria saw Emma crying quietly while her grandparents held her hands and shared tissues. Sarah would be proud of Emma, obviously, Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion. But I think she would also be proud of me for finally allowing myself to emerge from hiding, for using my skills to help families like ours, for choosing to love again despite knowing what loss costs. And I think she would be proud of Victoria Sterling, who responded to her own mistakes by trying to become someone different, who turned guilt into genuine commitment, who learned to value connection over control and vulnerability over dominance. This foundation exists because people can change, because circumstances can transform from cruel to kind, because sometimes the worst moments open doors to possibilities you never imagined. He returned to his seat with applause following, and Victoria immediately embraced him, not caring who was watching or what assumptions they made, just needing to communicate physically what words couldn't quite capture. They had been officially together for a year now, had navigated the complicated process of blending lives while respecting Emma's primacy and honoring Sarah's memory, and Victoria had discovered that love was simultaneously harder and more rewarding than she had imagined, requiring constant attention and communication and willingness to be uncomfortable but providing meaning that made every sacrifice worthwhile. After the formal ceremony concluded, the crowd moved to the reception area where photographs and displays documented the Foundation's programs, where children who had been early participants stood ready to discuss their projects and experiences, where the energy was celebration mixed with purpose and hope. Victoria found herself surrounded by board members and donors and community leaders all wanting to discuss expansion possibilities and sustainability planning, and she engaged with practiced competence while part of her attention tracked Marcus and Emma moving through the crowd, stopping to speak with people, accepting congratulations, and sharing stories. At one point Victoria looked up to find Sarah's mother standing before her, an older woman with Emma's eyes and Sarah's gentle expression, and Victoria felt nervous uncertainty about what this woman must think of her, the woman who had humiliated her son-in-law and was now involved romantically with her daughter's widower. But Sarah's mother simply pulled Victoria into a hug that felt like acceptance rather than judgment, and when she pulled back, her eyes were wet with tears that seemed to be joy rather than grief. "Thank you for loving them," Sarah's mother said quietly. "Thank you for seeing Marcus's worth when he was trying so hard to be invisible. Thank you for treating Emma like the remarkable child she is. Thank you for building something that honors my daughter's memory and values. Sarah would like you, Victoria. She would appreciate that you're trying to become someone different, that you're willing to be vulnerable, that you treat her family with genuine care. I hope you know that you have my blessing, for whatever that's worth." Victoria broke down completely at that, crying in a way she rarely allowed herself to cry even now after a year of therapy and intentional emotional work, and Sarah's mother simply held her while she processed the weight of acceptance she hadn't known she desperately needed. When Victoria finally composed herself enough to speak, she said the truth that had been building in her heart for months now. "I love them so much it scares me. I love Emma like she's my own daughter, and I love Marcus in ways I didn't know I was capable of feeling. And I know I can never replace Sarah, would never try to replace her, but I hope I can be someone who adds value to their lives, who helps them continue healing while honoring what they lost. You already are, dear. That's obvious to anyone who watches the three of you together. And Sarah wouldn't want to be replaced. She would just want her family to be happy and loved and living fully. You're helping make that possible. That's enough." The reception continued for another hour, Victoria splitting her time between professional networking and personal connection, finding herself increasingly comfortable moving between those roles rather than compartmentalizing completely the way she used to. When the crowd finally began departing and the staff started cleanup, Victoria found Marcus and Emma standing together examining a photograph of Sarah teaching a class, both of them quiet and contemplative in ways that suggested they were processing complicated emotions. Victoria approached carefully, not wanting to intrude on private grief, but Emma noticed her and immediately extended a hand in invitation. Victoria took it and stood beside them looking at the photograph, seeing in Sarah's face the joy and purpose that had defined her too brief life, understanding more fully what Marcus and Emma had lost and feeling gratitude that they had chosen to include her in what they were building from those ruins. "She was beautiful," Victoria said quietly. "Not just physically, though she was that too, but beautiful in how she looked at those children, how she made them feel seen and valued. I wish I could have known her. She would have challenged you, Marcus said with a slight smile. She had strong opinions about corporate responsibility and educational equity. She would have pushed you to be better, to use your resources for community good, to recognize that power was only meaningful if exercised with purpose beyond profit. I think she would approve of who you're becoming, but she wouldn't have been gentle about pushing you to get there. I would have needed that pushing. Still need it, honestly. You and Emma provide it in gentle ways, but sometimes I need someone to be direct about when I'm reverting to old patterns or prioritizing control over connection. I hope you'll keep doing that, both of you. I hope you'll keep teaching me how to be someone worth loving. Emma looked up at Victoria with an expression of such mature wisdom that Victoria wondered how this 8-year-old child had become so emotionally intelligent. Victoria, you're already someone worth loving. You don't have to earn it or prove it or perform it. You just have to keep showing up honestly and trying your best and choosing us even when it's hard. That's all any of us can do. Victoria knelt down and pulled Emma into a hug, this child who had somehow become hers even though they shared no biology, this brilliant, passionate, generous person who had welcomed her into their family and taught her what unconditional acceptance felt like. Thank you, Emma. For letting me be part of your life, for teaching me what really matters, for being patient with me while I learn. I love you very much. I love you too, Victoria. And I'm really glad Dad found you, even though it started with that mean bet. Sometimes the worst things lead to the best things if people are brave enough to change. Emma pulled back and looked between Victoria and Marcus with the particular expression she wore when she was about to say something she found significant. Can I ask you something important? Of course, sweetheart, Marcus said, his voice carrying slight concern about what might be coming. Are you going to get married? Because you've been dating for a year now and you obviously love each other and we all live together half the time anyway, and I think it would be nice to be an official family instead of just people who love each other but aren't formally connected. Also, some kids at school asked if Victoria is my stepmom and I didn't know what to say because she's not technically but she kind of is functionally, so having an official answer would be helpful. Victoria and Marcus exchanged glances over Emma's head, and Victoria saw in his expression a mix of surprise and hope and the question of whether she was ready for that level of commitment. They had discussed marriage theoretically, had acknowledged that they were building towards something permanent, but Emma's direct question forced the conversation from abstract future to concrete present. Emma, Victoria said carefully, marriage is a big decision that your dad and I would need to discuss privately before involving you in the details. But I can tell you that I love both of you completely, that I want to be part of your family permanently, and that when the time comes for your dad and me to make that kind of commitment official, you'll be the first person we tell. Is that answer sufficient for now? Emma considered this with visible deliberation before nodding. That's fair. But just so you know, I'm completely in favor of you getting married whenever you're ready. I think you're good together, and I like having you around, and I think Mom would approve of you joining our family officially. So when you do have that private discussion, you can tell Dad that I'm voting yes. Marcus laughed, genuine and warm, and pulled Emma close while extending his other arm to include Victoria in the embrace. Noted, sweetheart. Your vote is recorded and will be given appropriate weight during our private discussions. Now, it's past 9 p.m. and you have engineering camp tomorrow morning, so we should probably head home. They left the hotel together, the three of them walking to the parking garage where both Marcus's old car and Victoria's newer vehicle were parked side by side, and Emma climbed into Marcus's back seat while he secured her seatbelt with practiced efficiency. Victoria leaned against her own car watching them interact, watching the easy familiarity of parent and child who had navigated grief and hardship together and come through stronger, and she felt overwhelmed with gratitude that they had chosen to include her in their lives. Marcus walked over after Emma was secured, and he pulled Victoria close with the kind of natural affection that had developed over a year of learning each other's bodies and preferences and the particular ways they fit together. That was quite a question, he said quietly, his breath warm against her ear. It was. And Marcus, I want you to know that my answer was honest. I do want to be part of your family permanently. I do love you both completely. And when you're ready to have that conversation about making things official, I'm ready too. No pressure, no timeline, just honesty about my intentions and hopes. Marcus pulled back slightly to look at her face, and Victoria saw in his expression something that made her heart race with hope and anticipation. Victoria Sterling, I love you in ways I didn't think I would ever love anyone again after Sarah died. You've taught me that opening yourself to love again doesn't diminish what came before but rather honors it by demonstrating that love created a person capable of continuing to love despite loss. And I would be honored to build an official family with you, to make you Emma's stepmother formally, to create something permanent together that acknowledges how much you've already become essential to both our lives. Is that a proposal? Victoria asked, her voice shaking slightly with emotion she didn't try to hide. Not yet. That deserves planning and the right moment and probably Emma's involvement in creating something she'll remember as special. But it's a promise that the proposal is coming, probably sooner than you might expect, and when it does, I hope you'll say yes. I will absolutely say yes, Victoria said, certain beyond any doubt. I'll say yes with enthusiasm and gratitude and the understanding that I'm the luckiest person alive to be invited into this family that I did nothing to deserve but everything to treasure. They kissed in the parking garage while Emma watched from the back seat and made exaggerated gagging sounds that turned into giggles, and Victoria felt happiness that was complicated by awareness of Sarah's absence but not diminished by it, felt hope for a future that honored the past while building something new, felt blessed beyond measure to have been given a second chance she would spend the rest of her life trying to deserve. Thank you for experiencing this journey. If it moved you, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, hit like to support the channel, and check the description for more stories where broken people find their way back to wholeness. Subscribe to join this community of believers in second chances.